The dinner bell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, the way it always did, the way it had rung every evening, for as long as Alara Ashford could remember. She heard it from the top of the stairs, where she had been standing for 3 minutes already, her hand resting on the banister, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She was not thinking about what she would eat. She was not thinking about the conversations that would fill the room below. She was thinking about a number, a very specific number that she had discovered that afternoon in her father's account book, a number that should not have been where it was, and whose presence there told a quiet, slow-moving story that nobody else in the house appeared to have noticed. She let go of the banister. She walked down. The dining room at Ashford Hall was not a grand room by the standards of the northern county families who occasionally visited and occasionally stayed longer than was comfortable. It was wide enough, and the ceiling was high enough, and the chandelier above the long table had been purchased by her grandfather at a sale in Edinburgh before she was born. But it had not been cleaned in years. The crystals had gone dull with dust and age, and the light that came through them now was the color of old tea, slightly brown, slightly dim. Nobody had ever mentioned this. Nobody seemed to see it. Her father sat at the head of the table. Lord Edmund Ashford was a man of 54, who had the posture of someone who had once been told he was important, and had spent 3 decades trying to keep his body from forgetting it. He wore the same dark coat he wore every evening. He had already poured his first glass of wine. He did not look up when Alara came into the room. Her 2 brothers were already seated. Oliver, the eldest at 26, was speaking with the animated confidence of someone whose opinions had never once been seriously questioned. He was describing a horse race he had attended in York the previous week, a race he claimed to have almost bet on, a story he had already told twice this week at this same table. Her younger brother, Frederick, who was 21, and recently returned from a short and undistinguished period of study at a college that had not required much of him, was eating a bread roll and nodding, with the expression of someone who was listening, just enough to appear to be listening. Her mother, Lady Constance Ashford, sat to her husband's left, straight-backed and composed, the way she always sat, the way she had been trained to sit when she was a girl and had never stopped. She was arranging items on the table near her with small, precise movements. A fork, a salt cellar, the edge of a linen napkin. She did not look up either when Alara entered. Alara took her seat at the far end of the table. This had not always been her seat. When she was a child, she had sat closer to the middle, between Oliver and her mother, and sometimes her father had spoken to her directly about her lessons, about the garden, about a bird he had seen from his study window. She could not say exactly when the drift had begun, the slow, gradual movement down the table, one occasion at a time, one slightly overlooked setting at a time, until here she was at 22, seated at the end, with 2 empty chairs between her and the nearest person, which happened to be Frederick, who would not turn her way, unless he needed her to pass the salt. She unfolded her napkin. The soup arrived. Oliver finished his horse racing story, which ended, as all his stories ended, with him making a wise decision that other less perceptive men had failed to make. Frederick laughed in the right places. Her father made a sound that meant he had heard, which was not the same thing as meaning he had listened. "The Parkers have let another field go to nothing," her father said, setting down his spoon. "Wasted. Absolutely wasted. A man like Parker, with the land he has, and he cannot manage a simple rotation. It is embarrassing." "I heard he lost his head steward last winter," Oliver said. "Never found a decent replacement." "That is no excuse," Lord Ashford said. "A man is responsible for his own land. A competent man keeps his affairs in order, regardless of who leaves his employ." Alara looked at her soup. She thought about the number again, the number she had found that afternoon. She had been in her father's study, not because she had been invited, but because the study was where the account books were kept, and the account books were where she went when she had an hour to herself, and no one was watching the shelf. She had been doing this for 6 years. It had begun, this habit, quite accidentally, when she was 16, and had been sent to retrieve a letter from her father's desk, and had, while looking for the letter, noticed an open ledger page with a column of figures that did not add to what the total at the bottom claimed. She had stood there for a moment, added the column herself in her head, added it again to be certain, and then found the letter and left. But she had come back the next day, and the day after that, and gradually, over months that turned into years, She had made herself familiar with every account her father kept, every invoice, every rent record, every note of debt and credit, without a single person in the house knowing she was doing it. She had a sharp mind for numbers. She had always known this, the way one knows things about oneself that nobody around you acknowledges. She had never been told she was good at mathematics. She had never been told she was good at anything in particular, apart from an occasional remark about her needlework, which she found tedious, or her handwriting, which she did find pleasing, but did not think was a skill that mattered very much in the actual running of anything. Numbers, though. Numbers sat inside her mind, the way letters sit inside a sentence. Naturally, necessarily, without effort. The number she had found that afternoon was this: £1,200 that appeared in a record of estate expenses, under a category listed simply as land improvement works, but which corresponded to no improvement she had ever seen or heard mentioned, and which had been entered not once, but 3 times, across a period of 18 months, each entry in the slightly different handwriting of their steward, a man named Graves, who had held his position for 9 years, and who was widely regarded by her father as efficient and trustworthy. £3,600. Gone. Very quietly. Over a year and a half. She had sat with the ledger open in front of her for a long time before she closed it and put it back. "Alara," her mother said, and Alara looked up. Her mother was looking at her in the particular way that meant she had not been paying attention to something she was supposed to have been paying attention to. "The bread," Frederick said, not looking at her. He gestured vaguely in her direction. She passed the bread. Oliver had moved on to a different subject. He was now describing a plan he had developed for improving the income from one of the estate's tenant farms, a plan which involved an investment in new equipment that he had read about in a publication he had received in the post, and which he had been working on, he said, for several weeks. He described it with the confidence of someone who had never once been wrong in front of this family, because this family had never once told him he was. Her father was listening, with the attentive approval he reserved for Oliver's ideas, which was a different kind of attention from what he gave to Frederick's ideas, which was patient tolerance, and a very different kind from what he gave to Alara's ideas, which was generally nothing at all, because Alara had learned before she was 17 not to offer them. She ate her soup. She was not angry. That was the thing about living inside a house like this, inside a family like this, for long enough. The anger had burned brightly once, when she was younger, when she had still believed that being seen was a matter of trying harder, speaking more clearly, being more present. She had tried those things. She had tried very hard, and she had learned, slowly, without anyone teaching her, that the issue was not effort. The issue was that the story of who she was had been written before she was old enough to write it herself, and the people around her had been reading from that version for so long that they did not believe any other version existed. She was Alara, the youngest, the daughter, the quiet one, the one without Oliver's easy authority, or Frederick's at least tolerable comedy, the one without prospects that interested anyone, the one whose seat had drifted, season by season, to the end of the table. She had stopped being angry about it, somewhere around the age of 19. What she felt now, most of the time, was something she could not name precisely but which felt like standing on the bank of a river, watching it move, and knowing that everything happening in front of you is information, and information, if you are patient enough, and careful enough, and quiet enough, eventually becomes something useful. The soup plates were cleared. The main course arrived. Oliver finished his description of the equipment plan and turned to her father for approval, which arrived in the form of a single nod and the words, "worth looking into," which was the highest praise her father gave to anything that was not a horse or a piece of property. Frederick asked whether there was more of the roasted potato. There was. It was passed to him. Not by Alara this time, because she had moved her arms slightly back from the table, and the footman had gotten there first. "I had a letter from Aldrich Voss," her father said, the way he said important things, which was in the middle of a pause between other things, casually, as though the information had simply arrived in his mouth without intention. "He inquires about the western field boundary, that same business from last autumn. The Voss land runs right up against it," Oliver said. "He wants to settle the line. It has never been formally drawn. He wants more than that," her father said, and took a sip of wine. "He wants to purchase. He has made that clear in every letter for 2 years. I do not intend to sell. The Voss family has a great deal of money, her mother said quietly, refilling her own water glass. A great deal of money does not entitle a man to land that is not his, her father said. No, her mother agreed, of course not. Ilara looked at her plate. She knew about the Voss land and the Voss letters. She had read the copies her father kept, neatly filed in the second drawer of his study desk. She had also read the corresponding account entries and understood something that, as far as she could tell, nobody sitting at this table had understood. The western field boundary in question was not merely a line on a map. The field on the Ashford side of that line had not produced a meaningful income in 4 years, due to drainage problems that had never been properly addressed, and the cost of addressing them was sitting somewhere in the account books under a line item that had been quietly reclassified 3 times to make it appear smaller than it was. The field was, in practical terms, a liability. Refusing to sell it was not a position of strength. It was a position of stubbornness, dressed in the clothing of pride. She did not say any of this. She had learned that saying things like this, at this table, produced one of 2 results. The first was silence, the particular silence of people who have decided not to hear something. The second was a very brief, slightly irritated look from her father that meant the topic was now closed. Neither result changed anything, and Ilara had no interest in speaking for the sake of speaking. She had always believed, in a quiet and firm way that she could not entirely explain, that if you were going to say something, it should be something that mattered, and it should be said at the right moment, to the right person, in circumstances where it might actually do something in the world besides produce discomfort. That moment had not arrived yet. She was patient. She was very, very patient. Dessert came and went. Oliver told another story, this one about a man he had met in town who had made a considerable sum of money through some transaction that Oliver did not entirely understand, but described with authority anyway. Frederick ate his pudding, her mother sipped her tea. Her father read a letter that had arrived late and had been brought to him at the table, which was something he did that nobody had ever questioned, and nobody ever would. Ilara folded her napkin. She placed it beside her plate. She thought about the 3,600 pounds. She thought about the drainage field. She thought about the Voss letters, polite and persistent, sitting in a drawer while outside. The western boundary of the Ashford estate quietly went on being a problem that nobody at this table could see, because nobody at this table was looking at the right things. She thought about her second ledger, the one she kept herself, in a plain notebook she had purchased with money, saved from small household allowances over 2 years, stored in the bottom of her wardrobe beneath 2 older dresses she no longer wore, the one that showed what was actually happening. She excused herself from the table. Nobody asked where she was going. She went upstairs, changed from her dinner dress into a plain house dress, lit the candle on her desk, and opened the notebook. She wrote down the number, 1200, 3 times. She wrote, Graves. She underlined it once. Then she sat back and looked at what she had written for a long time, and the candle burned beside her in the quiet of the house, and downstairs she could hear the faint sound of Oliver laughing at something he himself had just said, and then silence, and then the creak of the floorboards as her father walked toward his study and shut the door. She turned the page. She began to calculate what could be recovered and what could be proven, and what, if the right person ever looked at the right pages, would be impossible to explain away. She wrote for 2 hours. The candle burned down to half. She closed the notebook. She put it back beneath the dresses. She lay in the dark and thought, not yet. But soon, someone would come. Someone who was not a member of this family would sit in this house one day, in this room or another, and they would ask the right question, and she would be ready with the answer. She had been getting ready for years. She did not know his name yet. The burrito was cold. She did not know it would be a Duke. She only knew that when the moment arrived, she would not be caught unprepared. The end of the table had given her something none of her family had understood they were giving her. It had given her invisibility. And invisibility, properly used, is not a weakness. It is the most powerful position in the room. The next morning she was up before the house. That was another habit she had developed without deciding to, something that had grown naturally from the life she lived inside these walls. Early morning was the only time the house belonged to her. The kitchen staff arrived at 6, But before that, in the blue-gray quiet, before anyone else had descended the stairs, she had the corridors, the sitting rooms, and her father's study to herself. She did not take the ledger out again that morning. She had already taken from it what she needed the night before. What she did instead was stand at the window of the sitting room on the ground floor, the one that looked out over the east garden, and beyond it to the long flat stretch of the home field, and watch the light come up over the hill. The estate was beautiful in the morning. She had always known this, the way you know things about a place you have lived in all your life, without ever having been given permission to love it. The hill to the east caught the first light, and held it for a long moment, before the rest of the sky caught up, and in those few minutes, the grass on the hillside was the color of copper, and the air had a particular quality of stillness that made everything feel both very close and very far away. She thought about what it meant that this place was failing. Not loudly, not catastrophically, but slowly, the way things fail when nobody is paying attention, and the people who ought to be paying attention are, instead, arguing about horse races, and reading about equipment in publications, and telling themselves that their position is strong because their name is old. The Ashford name was indeed old. It was 4 generations old in this county, which was enough to carry weight in certain conversations, and not quite enough to carry debt indefinitely. Her father did not appear to understand the difference. Or perhaps he did understand it, and had simply decided not to think about it, which was a strategy Alara had observed to be extremely popular among men of his particular type. She had done the calculation 18 months ago. If the current rate of quiet mismanagement continued, the estate would need to either sell significant land or take on a level of formal debt within 4 to 6 years that would make selling the land inevitable anyway. The western field, the one her father refused to sell to the Voss family, was the most logical piece to let go, because its income contribution was now negative when the drainage maintenance was properly accounted for. Selling it would free capital. It would solve 2 problems at once. Her father would rather keep it and have a problem than sell it and appear to have conceded something to a man whose family had not owned land in this county quite as long as the Ashfords had. This was the arithmetic of pride, and it was the most expensive arithmetic Alara knew. She turned from the window. She went to the kitchen, where the cook, a woman named Mrs. Bland who had worked at Ashford Hall for 11 years, and was the only person in the house who consistently treated Alara as though she were a full and competent human being, was just beginning her morning preparations. "You are up early again," Mrs. Bland said, without looking up from the bread she was beginning to shape. "I always am," Alara said. "There is tea in the pot. Made it for myself 10 minutes ago. Still hot." Alara poured herself a cup and sat at the end of the kitchen table, the worn wooden end where the household accounts had been discussed, and various small domestic crises had been resolved over many years. She liked this table. It was a working table. It had no pretensions. Things that happened at it were practical and real. "Did you sleep?" Mrs. Bland asked. "Enough." Mrs. Bland glanced at her once, with the particular expression she reserved for this kind of answer, which was an expression that said she knew exactly what enough meant in this context, and had opinions about it that she was too sensible to voice. They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while. "The Duke Voss is coming," Alara said, because she had decided in the night that there was no reason to keep this to herself, and because Mrs. Bland would know about it within 2 days regardless. Mrs. Bland looked up. "When?" "My father expects him before the month is out. A formal visit. He is coming to discuss the boundary matter again. And my father will not sell." Mrs. Bland turned the bread. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "What does your father intend to do instead?" "I do not believe he intends anything," Alara said. "I believe he intends to make clear that he does not intend to sell, and then invite the Duke to dinner, and then the matter will sit where it has always sat. While the field does nothing." "While the field does nothing," Alara agreed. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup herself, which she always did, because she had been told once by her mother that it was unnecessary, and had decided immediately that this was exactly the kind of unnecessary thing she intended to keep doing. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk. She did not open the notebook yet. Instead, she took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write out, from memory, every figure she knew, from the Ashford accounts that pertained to the western field and to the drainage work, and to the invoices that bore the handwriting of Mr. Graves. She wrote in columns, clear and small, the way she always wrote numbers, because she found that numbers which were given enough space to breathe were easier to think alongside. She wrote everything she knew. She wrote what she could prove. She wrote what she suspected. She wrote what she could not yet explain. Then she sat back and read it all again. She was not frightened by what she saw. She had been looking at it too long to be frightened by it. What she felt, reading the columns of her own clear handwriting in the early morning light, was something much simpler and much more useful than fear. She felt ready. He arrived on a Thursday. She knew he was coming, 2 hours before the carriage reached the gates, because she had been watching from the upstairs corridor window that looked out over the long gravel drive, not because she was eager, but because she had learned that watching arrivals was one of the most informative things a person could do. A great deal about a visitor could be understood before they opened their mouth, if you paid attention to the right details: the carriage, the horses, the pace, the way the door opened, and who stepped out first, and how they stood when their feet met the ground. Duke Aldrich Voss stepped out of the carriage, the way a man steps down from a height he is used to. There was nothing dramatic about it, no performance of arrival. He simply came down, straightened his coat with one hand, looked at the house, and looked at it the way Alara looked at things, which was to say completely, taking it in from one end to the other without hurry, before he had decided what he thought. He was younger than she had imagined. That was the first thing. The name Duke Voss had sat in her mind for 2 years, as a name on letters, a figure in account records, a persistent presence in her father's conversation, and somehow she had constructed him, without meaning to, as an older man, a heavy man, the kind of man who bought land the way her father spent money, out of habit and station. The man on the gravel drive was perhaps 30, or not much past it, and he was lean rather than heavy, and his face had the particular quality of attention that made him look, even standing still, as though he were in the middle of thinking something through. He had a secretary with him, a younger man who descended from the carriage immediately after and began managing luggage with efficient movements. The Duke did not watch the luggage. He watched the house. Then, as though she had made a sound or a movement, his eyes moved to the upstairs window. She stepped back, not quickly, not with embarrassment, just back, out of the angle of light where she had been standing. She did not know whether he had seen her. She thought probably he had. She thought this without emotion, simply as information. She went to her room. She changed from her morning dress into an afternoon dress, because her mother would expect this, and because disappointing her mother on small matters of presentation, on days when the house had a formal visitor, was an energy expenditure she had long ago decided was not worth making. She wore a plain gray-blue dress with good buttons. She pinned her hair up neatly. She looked at herself in the small mirror on her wardrobe door and thought, adequate. Then she went downstairs. Her father was already in the front hall, receiving the Duke with the particular blend of warmth and formality that he deployed with people he needed to be polite to but did not intend to give what they wanted. Oliver was beside him, looking the part of the helpful eldest son. Frederick was slightly behind Oliver, standing in a way that suggested he had been told to be there and had complied. Her mother appeared from the drawing room in the same moment that Alara reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a brief second, through some chance of positioning, the Duke looked directly at Alara as she stepped off the last stair. "Lord Ashford," he said, turning immediately to her father and extending his hand. "Thank you for your hospitality. Duke Voss, welcome to Ashford Hall." The introduction proceeded in the usual order. Oliver first, then Frederick, then her mother, then, at the end, the way things at this house always seemed to go, Alara. "My daughter, Alara," her father said, with the particular inflection that made the word daughter sound like a word for a category rather than a person. "Miss Ashford," the Duke said, and he looked at her when he said it, directly, the same way he had looked at the house, which was to say completely, without hurry, without any decorative expression of polite pleasure, just a look, clear, brief. "Duke Voss," she said. Then her father was already steering him toward the drawing room, and the conversation moved on, and she followed at the appropriate distance behind her mother, and that was the introduction. She had been told, in various ways, across various years, that she was not a remarkable-looking young woman. She had understood this, not to mean that she was without qualities, but that the qualities she had were not the kind that drew immediate attention in a room. Her features were even rather than striking. Her manner was quiet rather than vivid. She did not animate a room the way some women animated a room, with laughter and movement and a brightness that made people look. She had never wanted to animate a room that way. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was to understand the room, to know what was actually happening in it, rather than what appeared to be happening. These were different skills, and she had always known, in the quiet and certain way she knew most things about herself, that hers was the more useful one, even if it was less frequently celebrated. In the drawing room, the Duke sat in the chair that her father indicated, which was across from her father's own preferred chair by the fireplace, and accepted tea, and the conversation began in the way formal drawing room conversations between men of property begin, which is slowly, and sideways, approaching the actual subject from a considerable distance. Her father spoke about the weather in the north that autumn. The Duke said it had been much the same on his side of the county. Her father commented on the condition of the road from the Duke's estate, which was apparently under repair in one section. The Duke said it was expected to be completed before winter set in. Oliver made a remark about his horse's opinion of newly graveled roads in general. Frederick laughed. Her mother offered more tea. Alara sat slightly apart from the central grouping of chairs, to the left of the fireplace, in a chair that had been placed against the wall to accommodate the visitors, and which she had taken, because nobody had offered it to her, and because she preferred it. From here she could see the room well. She could see her father's face when he spoke, and when he listened. She could see the Duke's. There was a difference in the quality of attention between these two men that became apparent within the first 10 minutes of conversation. Her father listened, the way men in his position often listened, which was with his body arranged in the posture of listening, while his mind worked on what he was going to say next. The Duke listened with his whole face. When her father spoke, the Duke watched him. When Oliver spoke, the Duke shifted his gaze to Oliver, and watched him too, with the same quality of attention, neither more nor less. He had, she noticed, a very still quality when he was listening. He did not move his hands. He did not lean or shift. He just listened, and his face showed that he was listening, not with any performed interest, but with genuine attention. And she found herself wondering, in the abstract way she wondered about things that interested her, what he was actually thinking, while all of this polite preliminary conversation about weather and road conditions was taking place. She suspected he was thinking about the Western Field. She suspected he had been thinking about the Western Field for quite some time. Tea was finished. Her father suggested a brief walk of the grounds before supper, which was the traditional Ashford hospitality move, for visitors arriving in the afternoon. The Duke said he would be very glad to, and they all rose, and the men went ahead, and Alara and her mother followed at the slight distance that was the custom, though it was not a custom that had ever been formally stated. The walk took them along the south side of the house and into the formal garden, which was well kept in the central sections near the house, and noticeably less maintained in the outer edges, where the gardener's attention reached less frequently. Alara always noticed this. She had mentioned it once to her mother, who had said that the outer edges were perfectly adequate. She had not mentioned it again, but she noticed it every time. They walked around to the east garden, and then the Duke, who had been walking alongside her father and Oliver, said something that caused the group to stop. He was looking out to the north, toward the long, flat stretch of land that ran from the garden's edge, toward the distant line of trees that marked the boundary between the Ashford property and his own. The eastern drainage channel, he said. Has it been opened again since the autumn work? Her father said the drainage channel in the eastern section was being attended to. His voice had the slightly elevated quality it acquired when he was saying something he intended to sound definitive, but which was not quite true. I ask, the Duke said, because I had a similar problem on the northeast corner of my own land 2 years ago. The solution we found was not expensive, in the end, but it required looking at the overall water flow across 3 fields, rather than treating each one separately. If I might be of any use on that question, I would be glad to send my land manager to have a look. That is very kind, her father said. There is no need at present. The Duke nodded once. He said nothing else on the subject. He turned back to the walk, and the conversation moved on to other things. But Alara had been watching his face when her father said there was no need at present, and she had seen, very briefly, the faintest movement in his expression, something so small and so controlled that she was not certain she had seen it at all. A single slight adjustment at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, not a reaction of frustration, something more like recognition, as though he had heard exactly what he expected to hear and had filed it precisely where he expected to file it. He knew. She was not certain what he knew, exactly, but she was certain that his understanding of the Ashford estate's management was considerably more accurate than her father understood it to be. She found this interesting. She found it very interesting indeed. At supper that evening, the table was set differently for a guest. Alara was moved one chair closer to the center, which put her at Frederick's elbow instead of 2 chairs away. She was not certain whether this had been her mother's decision, or simply a consequence of how the extra chair had been fitted in for the Duke. It did not matter. She was still well below the center of things. The Duke sat to her father's right, which was the correct position for a guest of rank. The supper conversation was the kind that drew all 3 of the Ashford men into a kind of performance. Oliver spoke about his ideas for the estate, with even more authority than usual. Frederick told a story that was nearly amusing. Her father made several pronouncements about the county, about the state of agriculture, about a recent report he had read, each pronouncement carrying the weight of a man who believed his own understanding of things was essentially accurate and needed no significant revision. The Duke listened. He responded when addressed. He asked 1 or 2 specific questions that prompted her father to expand on a subject, questions that were themselves informative because they told you, if you were paying attention, exactly what the person asking them already understood and was choosing to probe rather than disclose. The question he asked about the winter rye yields in the North Field. The question he asked, apparently casually, about whether the Ashford estate still employed a factor for the upland grazing portion. She watched him ask these questions and she thought, this man is not here to buy the field. Not only to buy the field, he is here to understand the whole picture. He wants to know what he would be buying if he were ever in the position of buying more than one field. She ate her food. She said nothing. Nobody asked her anything. And then, somewhere between the fish course and the meat, her father made a comment about the estate's accounts, how well managed they were, how he credited his steward Graves with a good deal of the efficiency, and the Duke said something polite in response, and her father said, with the particular confidence of a man who has just been given a compliment by someone he intends to impress, that the account books were in excellent order, very clean, very clear, kept to the highest standard. And Alara looked at her plate. She thought about the £3,600. She thought about the 3 entries, the handwriting of Graves, the land improvement works that had never happened. She thought, he will find out eventually. Men like this always do. The only question is when, and whether it will be soon enough to matter, and whether, when it happens, there will be anything left to recover. She thought, I already know. She thought, I have known for months. She did not say anything. She passed the bread when Frederick gestured for it. She waited. After supper, the men retired to her father's study, as they always did when there was a guest of standing, and her mother went to the small sitting room, and Alara went upstairs under the pretense of an early night. She was, in fact, going to her desk. She lit her candle and opened the notebook. She added what she had learned at the supper table. Not the conversation itself, word for word, but the specific pieces of information she had extracted from it. The Duke's questions. The precise things he had not said. The way he had responded to her father's claim about the accounts, which had been with a polite and unremarkable remark about reliable estate management being essential to long-term prosperity. A remark that sounded like agreement and contained, if you listened to it carefully enough, nothing of the kind. She wrote, he understands property. He understands accounts. He does not believe what my father tells him, but he does not intend to say so. He is building a picture quietly. She underlined the word quietly. She stared at it for a moment. Then she underlined the word she had written 2 lines above. He does not believe what my father tells him. She was not surprised by this. She was not surprised by any of it. What she was, sitting at her desk with the candlelight making the shadows in the room shift very slightly with each small movement of air, was thoughtful. Specifically, she was thinking about what it meant that a man of this kind had come into this house, a man who was clearly not what the Ashford family believed him to be, which was a persistent nuisance offering money for a field they did not want to sell. He was something considerably more than that. He was a man who understood what was actually happening here. And he was, apparently, content to understand it quietly, without announcing his understanding to anyone who would not know what to do with it. That was its own kind of intelligence. She wrote one more line before she closed the notebook. She wrote, "I wonder if he keeps a second book too." Then she put the notebook away, extinguished the candle, and lay in the dark thinking about a man who watched a house the way she watched a room, from the outside, completely, before he had decided what he thought. The morning after, he was gone before she came down. His carriage had left at first light, and her father had seen him off, and by the time she reached the kitchen for her early cup of tea with Mrs. Bland, the only evidence of the Duke's presence was a single folded note on the hall table, left for her father, which she did not read, because it was addressed to her father, and she had her own methods of learning things. She did not need to read every letter to understand what they contained. She needed to be patient. She went to the kitchen. She poured her tea. She sat at the worn table and thought about what came next, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in a long pale stripe, and somewhere outside, across the fields she had been watching all her life, the Voss estate began another day, without knowing that the quietest person at the Ashford supper table had spent 3 hours the previous night writing down everything she had learned about its new owner. She was 22 years old. She had been preparing for something for 6 years without knowing what it was. She was beginning to understand what it was. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup herself. She went back upstairs. She had work to do. The discovery she made on a gray Tuesday in late October was not dramatic in the way that discoveries are sometimes described. There was no sudden flash of clarity, no moment of striking revelation. It came in layers, the way truth usually comes when you have been sitting with the same numbers long enough to stop looking at them and start seeing them. She had been in her father's study for 40 minutes. The household was busy with the weekly linen count, which occupied the housekeeper and 2 of the maids in the upper rooms, and created the particular kind of organized noise that allowed a careful person to move through the lower floor of the house without being particularly visible. Her father was out on the estate for the morning, riding with Oliver to inspect a fence section that had come down in the previous week's wind. Frederick was still in his room. Her mother was in the sitting room writing letters. She had the study to herself. She had not planned to find what she found. She had been in the accounts primarily to check something she had noticed the previous week, an entry in the grain purchase records that appeared to duplicate a purchase made 6 weeks earlier. A small thing, possibly a clerical error, but she had learned over 6 years that small clerical errors in this particular set of books were worth examining, because the ones that were genuinely accidental had a different quality from the ones that were not. The grain entry turned out to be something she had already accounted for, a repurchase under a different supplier. She made a note of this and was about to close the book when she turned 1 page further than she intended to, and found herself looking at a quarterly summary she had not seen before. It was recent, dated only 6 weeks ago, and it covered, in condensed form, every income and expenditure category for the previous 12 months. She read it once, quickly, the way she always read things the first time, to get the shape of it. Then she read it again, slowly, and the shape changed. The third-year entry for field maintenance, Western sections, showed a figure of £480. This was a new entry category. She had not seen this name before. But the figure was familiar. £480 was, almost exactly, 3 times the figure of £160 that appeared in the individual monthly ledgers under drainage improvements across the western sections of the estate. 3 times 160. 480. She held this in her mind and looked at the individual monthly ledgers again, the ones she had been tracking for over a year. There were indeed 3 entries of £160 across the western drainage items in the relevant period. Each one was associated with an invoice. Each invoice bore a supplier name. She had checked the supplier names before, months ago, and they had appeared legitimate. Small local contractors, the kind of names that appeared in a dozen account books across the county. She checked them again now. And she found something she had not found the first time, because the first time she had been looking at each name in isolation. Looking at them together, in sequence, she noticed that 2 of the 3 contractor names shared a significant detail. Their correspondence addresses, noted on the invoice letterheads, were different street names in the same small town, a town about 14 miles east of the estate. But the handwriting on both invoices, the handwriting of the name and the address, was identical. Not similar. Identical. She had a good eye for handwriting. She had always had a good eye for it. The small, specific qualities of a person's hand that made it recognizable, even when the person believed they were writing a different way. The slope of certain letters. The particular join between a lowercase r and the letter that followed it. The way the pen lifted, or did not lift, between the letters of an I and the dot that sat above it. Both invoices had been written by the same person. Both contractor names were fiction. She sat with this understanding for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the floor. She looked at the ledger again, and then at the invoices, which she had taken from the file drawer to the left of the desk and laid open on the blotter. She thought, Graves. She thought, 18 months, at minimum. She thought, I need to know how many names. It took her another 22 minutes to work through the relevant files, with the methodical speed of someone who has been doing this long enough to know exactly what she is looking for. She found 4 supplier names in total across the maintenance and improvement categories. 4 names. She compared the handwriting on each invoice. 3 of the 4 were written by the same hand. The 4th was different, but its corresponding entry appeared only once, for a small amount, and she could not yet determine whether it was genuine. 3 fictional suppliers. She calculated the total across all entries associated with these 3 names over the period she could trace. The number she arrived at was not £1,200 per occurrence, as she had initially thought. That had been an estimate based on incomplete reading. The actual figure, when every relevant entry was added together across the 18 months she could trace with the records in front of her, was £4,210. She set down her pen. £4,210. This was not a minor discrepancy. This was not an administrative error. This was a systematic, planned, and carefully executed removal of money from the Ashford estate accounts, disguised behind fictional suppliers and genuine-looking invoices, carried out over a period of at least a year and a half, and managed with enough skill that nobody in this house had noticed it. Nobody had been looking. She had been looking. She closed the ledger. She closed the files. She replaced every item in precisely the position she had found it. She had long ago developed the habit of noting where things were before she touched them, not because she was afraid of being caught, but because she believed that a careful thinker left no evidence of carelessness. She smoothed the blotter. She checked the desk surface. She left the study and pulled the door to the same angle she had found it. She walked upstairs. She did not rush. In her room, she sat at her desk and opened her notebook and began to write. She wrote everything she had found, every figure, every name, every detail of the handwriting comparison, every invoice date, the total. She wrote clearly and quickly, without drama, the way she always wrote, because information in a state of agitation becomes unreliable, and she needed what she was writing to be exactly true. When she had finished writing, she read it back. Then she sat very still for a long time. The room was quiet. Outside, the October wind was moving through the elm trees at the end of the east garden, and the sound it made was the sound of large things being disturbed without being broken, a continuous low movement that was almost like water. She had always found this sound settling rather than unsettling. It had been the sound of her room in autumn, for as long as she had lived in this house. She thought about what she was now holding. She was holding, in a plain notebook in the bottom of her wardrobe, evidence of a significant financial crime against her father's estate. Evidence that their long-standing steward, a man her father trusted, a man who had keys to this house and access to every financial record it contained, had been systematically stealing from them for at least a year and a half, and possibly longer. She knew what any sensible person would do with this information. They would take it to the person whose money had been taken. They would hand it over. They would say, "Look what I found." She thought about doing this. She held the scenario in her mind and walked through it. She imagined going to her father's study when he returned from the morning ride. She imagined placing the notebook on his desk. She imagined saying, "I have been studying your accounts for 6 years, and I have found evidence that Graves has been removing money through fictitious contractor invoices, and the amount I can trace is £4,210, but there may be more, and here is exactly how I know." She held this scene, and examined it from every angle she could think of. The most likely response was not gratitude. The most likely first response was disbelief, followed by the slightly irritated look that meant the topic was being closed, followed by her father picking up the notebook and looking at it in the way people look at a document they have already decided not to believe. Then he would speak to Graves directly, not to confirm the evidence, but to give Graves the opportunity to explain it away, and Graves, who had been doing this carefully and cleverly for 18 months, would provide an explanation. It might not be a good explanation, but it would be delivered with the confidence of a man who had never been doubted in 9 years of service, and her father, who had chosen to trust Graves for 9 years, and who had a great deal invested in that choice, would find it credible enough. The evidence would then be dismissed, not because it was wrong, but because the right person had not presented it at the right time, in the right way, to the right audience. Timing mattered. She had always known this. The moment, if it came, needed to come when someone with the authority to act on what she had found was in a position to act on it, someone outside this family, someone who could not be managed by her father's need to believe in his own good judgment, someone whose interest in the truth was more powerful than their interest in preserving a comfortable version of events. She thought about the Duke. She thought about his questions at the supper table, his quality of attention, the way he had looked at the house before he decided what to think of it. She thought about the letter she had heard her father mention that had arrived from the Voss estate 2 weeks after the Duke's visit, the letter her father had described as another enquiry about the western boundary, which he had set aside to answer when he felt ready. He had not answered it yet. She was fairly certain the Duke had written more than once since then. She was fairly certain the Duke would write again. She opened her notebook again. She turned to a clean page at the back. She wrote 3 words at the top of the page. She wrote, "What can be proven?" Then she began the most careful, most methodical piece of work she had done in 6 years at this desk. She began to write out, not just the evidence, but the argument, the case, the step-by-step assembly of information that, placed in front of the right person, would be impossible to deny and impossible to explain away. She wrote the figures. She wrote the dates. She wrote the comparison of handwriting and what it meant. She wrote the name of the town where the fictional contractors' addresses were registered. She wrote what invoices corresponded to what ledger entries, and how each one failed when checked against any independent record of work actually carried out on the estate. She wrote for 3 hours. She used 8 pages. When she had finished, she looked at what she had built, and she thought, "This is a complete picture. This is not a suspicion or an observation. This is a case." She closed the notebook. She put it away. She went downstairs to lunch, where nobody mentioned anything of significance, and Oliver described the fence damage in some detail, and her father said the repair would need to happen before the first hard frost, and Frederick said something about having seen a bird of unusual size in the north field that morning, and her mother said she hoped it was not interfering with the chickens. Ilara ate her lunch. She said almost nothing. She was thinking about the Duke. She was thinking about how long a man of his particular quality of patience would wait before he came back. She did not think it would be very long. She was right about that. The letter came 6 days later. Her father read it at the breakfast table without comment, folded it, and placed it in the breast pocket of his coat, which was where he put things he intended to think about later. He said nothing about it during breakfast, and nothing during the morning, and nothing during lunch, and it was not until supper, somewhere between the first and second course, that he mentioned it at all. "Voss has written again," he said. "He intends to come for the winter shooting season. He says he has some additional thoughts on the boundary matter." "He will not give up," Oliver said, not without a small note of admiration. "A man who gives up is not worth dealing with," her father said, which was one of the remarks he made that sounded like a wisdom, but contained inside it, if you examined it carefully, a contradiction. Because a man who did not give up when Lord Ashford wanted him to was being described here as admirable, but when that persistence was being exercised in a direction her father did not want, it was supposed to be an annoyance. These kinds of contradictions ran through her father's stated beliefs, the way underground water ran through certain kinds of stone, invisible, powerful, shaping everything without being seen. "When does he plan to arrive?" her mother asked. "The second week of November," her father said. "He asks if we will host him for a few nights." This was different from the previous visit. The previous visit had been a day trip, a formal call, one night's dinner. A few nights meant more time, more meals, more conversation, more evenings in the drawing room and morning walks, and the kind of extended proximity in which it was much harder to be managed by a host who had decided what story he was telling. More time at the table. Elara ate her soup and said nothing. But in the 3 weeks between that supper and the second week of November, she did something she had never done before. She went back to her father's study, not once but 4 more times, at carefully chosen moments of household busyness, and she read every account entry she had not yet checked, every category she had marked as possibly relevant, every invoice she had not yet compared. She found 2 more things. The first was a small additional transfer, £40, in a category she had previously assumed was legitimate, which she now believed was a test. A single small fictional entry placed in an otherwise clean category, possibly to see whether anyone noticed. No one had noticed. It had been sitting there for 8 months. The second thing was more significant. She found, in a personal correspondence file that her father kept in a different drawer, not the main account files but a separate drawer she had not previously thought to examine, a letter. It was not from Graves. It was from a solicitor in the county town. A letter dated 4 months ago concerning a property matter that her father had apparently initiated and then allowed to sit unanswered. The property matter was this. Her father had taken out a private loan, secured against the value of the northern grazing section of the estate, for an amount of £900, borrowed from a private creditor, whose name appeared only as an initial. The letter from the solicitor reminded Lord Ashford that the repayment schedule had fallen behind, and that an amount of £120 was currently overdue. She read the letter twice. She put it back. She sat in the study for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, and she thought, he borrowed money, and he has not told Oliver. And the money he borrowed is secured against land that is not generating enough income to comfortably service the debt, because the income is lower than it should be, partly because of the drainage issue, and partly because of what Graves has been doing to the maintenance accounts. She thought, this estate is in considerably more difficulty than anyone at this table understands. She thought, except me. She went upstairs. She added what she had found to the notebook. The picture was now complete, or complete enough. When the Duke arrived in November, she would be ready. Not to hand him the notebook, not to perform any kind of dramatic disclosure. She did not work that way. She had always believed that useful things happened, not through performance, but through the right information, reaching the right person, at the exact right moment, placed without fanfare, and allowed to do its own work. She would wait for the right moment. She had waited 6 years. She could wait 3 more weeks. She closed the notebook. She made herself a cup of tea from the small pot she kept in her room for late evenings. She sat at her window and looked out at the dark October fields and thought about the loan and the debt and the money that had been quietly leaving this estate for a year and a half, and the man who was coming in November, who looked at houses the way she looked at rooms. She thought, he is going to be surprised. She thought, I am going to be ready. She was not afraid. She had spent years in a house that had given her every reason to feel small, and she had used every one of those years to become large in the one way available to her, which was inward, which was knowledge, which was the patient and invisible accumulation of understanding that nobody at this table knew she possessed. The candle burned. The fields were dark. She drank her tea and watched the night and waited. The Duke came back on a Wednesday. The weather had turned. There was a thin frost on the grass in the mornings now, and the elm trees at the end of the east garden had given up their last leaves, and the sky over the north fields had the particular steel-gray quality of November that made the whole landscape look as though it had been pressed flat under something heavy. Elara had always liked November. It was honest, in a way that the softer months were not. It did not pretend to be comfortable. It simply was what it was, gray and cold and clear. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Bland when she heard the carriage on the drive. She did not move immediately. She finished what she was saying, which was a comment about the amount of flour that had been ordered last week, and whether it was the correct quantity for the month ahead. A calculation she had made because Mrs. Bland had mentioned it was becoming difficult to keep track of when the account entries and the actual deliveries were being reconciled differently. She said, the order for November should be £42, not 38. The difference is in the extra baking for the shooting week. Mrs. Bland wrote this down on the small board she kept near the kitchen window for notes. Then Alara set down her cup, excused herself, and went to change. She heard, as she passed the hall, her father already at the front door, his voice warm in the way it became when he was being a host to someone whose good opinion mattered to him, even someone whose good opinion he would have preferred to obtain by other means than selling land. Oliver's voice, the sound of the door opening wide. She did not go to the hall. She changed into a clean afternoon dress, the same gray-blue she had worn at the first visit, but freshly pressed. She pinned her hair. She took the notebook from the bottom of her wardrobe and held it for a moment. She did not open it. She put it back. She knew every number in it. She had known them all for 2 weeks. She did not need to review them. What she needed, when the moment came, was not memory. It was the right 3 words at the right instant. She went downstairs. The Duke was already in the hallway. He had shaken hands with her father and Oliver, and acknowledged Frederick, and was in the process of saying something to her mother about the drive, which had been long, about an hour and a half from his own estate, and the roads north of the river were beginning to show the effects of the recent rains. He was in a dark coat and riding boots, the boots dusty from the journey, which Alara noticed because she noticed specific details about people that most people did not notice, and a man who traveled in riding boots over a long distance either intended to ride part of the way or simply preferred the comfort of them over formal travel shoes, and in either case, this told you something small but real about him. He saw her at the bottom of the stairs. This time there was a fraction more time between the seeing and the moment he spoke. She did not know what he did with that fraction. She only knew it existed. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Duke Voss," she said. "Welcome back." "Thank you." Her mother steered the group into the drawing room, and the visit began again in its formal, measured, sideways approaching manner. But this time, being a longer stay, the atmosphere of the drawing room had a slightly different quality. There was less of the careful preliminary exchange of men who were meeting for the second time to discuss something they had decided to approach slowly. They had already done 1 visit's worth of careful preliminary exchange. They were, by the standards of this kind of introduction, already slightly beyond the beginning. The Duke asked about the shooting on the estate. Her father described the arrangements with the restrained pride of a man who knew his shooting was not the best in the county, but was not the worst either. Oliver said the season so far had been reasonable. Frederick mentioned a dog. The Duke said he had a preference for walking the ground early, before the main party, to understand the cover, that he found the first morning's walk more interesting than most of the shooting itself, because it showed you how the land was actually lying. Alara looked at him across the room. She thought, "Yes, you would think that." She said nothing. The afternoon moved through the usual stages. Tea became a brief rest before supper preparations, and supper was again the long table with the dull chandelier and the same arrangement of people, though this time, because there was an extra day ahead, the conversation at supper had a slightly more exploratory quality. Her father, perhaps feeling more secure in his position as host, over a longer visit, allowed a little more range. He asked the Duke about his own estate's accounts, about the management philosophy he had inherited from his family, versus what he had developed himself, about whether he used a factor or managed directly. The Duke answered these questions with the particular kind of openness that was not actually revealing anything the other person could use against him. He spoke in general terms. He said that direct involvement in accounts was something he had always preferred to delegation. He said that understanding numbers yourself was the only way to understand an estate truly, not just what you were told about it. Her father agreed with this vigorously, which made Alara look at her plate and think about the loan document in the drawer, and the Graves invoices, and the £4,210 that her father did not know about, because he had not been paying attention to his own numbers in any meaningful way, for longer than anyone at this table would be comfortable knowing. She ate her fish. "Do you find," the Duke said, addressing her father, but with the slightly more open quality of a question that was not specifically directed, that in estates of this size, the accounts relating to maintenance and improvement are the most difficult to verify independently? Her father said yes, absolutely. The capital expenditure categories were always the most complex. Oliver said something about the difficulty of getting accurate estimates from contractors. Frederick nodded and then looked at his fish. Ilara looked at the Duke. He was not looking at her. He was looking at her father. She thought, why did he ask that particular question? She thought, maintenance and improvement accounts. Capital expenditure, contractor estimates. She thought, he already knows, or he suspects, and he is probing. She set down her fork very quietly and picked it up again. She thought about what she had in the notebook upstairs. She thought about how precisely what the Duke had just said aligned with the exact category of fraud she had been documenting for a year and a half. The maintenance accounts, the fictional contractors. This was not coincidence. She thought, he has seen something in the Ashford records from outside, through the transaction history, or the land records, or some other route she had not considered. He did not have access to the internal accounts, but he had access to public records, and to whatever could be gleaned from the pattern of the estate's external dealings. And someone as careful as this man, who had been writing letters about the western boundary for 2 years, and asking questions about drainage channels, and arriving in riding boots ready to walk the ground first, had been watching this estate for longer and more carefully than her father knew. He was not here only to buy the field. He was here because he understood that the Ashford estate was in difficulty, that its management was unsound, and that the moment at which something could be resolved was arriving. He was watching for the right moment. Just as she was. For the first time in her life, sitting at the farish end of the supper table at Ashford Hall, Ilara felt something that she could only describe as the sensation of being in a room with someone who was doing the same thing she was doing. Not the same thing on the surface, but underneath. She felt, very quietly, seen. Not seen in the way the room looked at Oliver when he spoke, with approval and easy familiarity. Not seen in the way the room looked at Frederick when he was amusing, with comfortable indulgence. Seen in the way that meant someone had noticed the quality of your attention and recognized it as kin to their own. She was not certain the Duke had noticed her at all, not really, not beyond the minimum required courtesies of a guest at a house with a daughter. She had no evidence for being seen. She had only a feeling, and she distrusted feelings in general as evidence of anything, because feelings had a poor track record of being accurate about the world as it actually was. She ate her supper. She said nothing. After the meal, when the men had gone to her father's study, and her mother had gone to the sitting room, Ilara went to the small library, which was the room in the house she liked best, and which was almost never occupied in the evenings. She took a book from the shelf without particularly caring which book it was, something about the improvement of agricultural land, and sat by the window with it open in her lap, and did not read it. She was thinking about what would happen when the right moment came. She was thinking about whether the right moment had already begun to arrive, slowly, like November coming in across the fields, gray and cold and honest. She thought about the Duke's question at supper, the precision of it. The way it had been placed not at the beginning or end of a conversation, but in the middle, in the slight gap after Oliver's remark about contractor estimates, so it sounded like a natural continuation, but was, in fact, a different thing entirely. She thought, this man knows how to ask a question that sounds like it belongs to the conversation, and does not. She recognized the technique, because she used it herself. She sat with the unread book in her lap, and the November dark outside the library window, and she thought about 2 people in the same house, who were both, separately, keeping track of the same set of problems, and how long it was before 2 separate calculations arrived at the same number, and somebody had to say it out loud. Not yet, she thought. She turned a page of the book she was not reading. But soon. The shooting the next day took the men out early. Ilara heard them assembling in the front hall before first light, the low voices and the sound of dogs, and the particular purposeful noise of men, with a clear plan for the morning. She heard her father, and Oliver's voice, higher and more energetic than her father's, and the Duke's voice, which she could now identify at a distance with something that felt like recognition. She stayed in her room until they had gone. She went to the kitchen. Mrs. Bland was already well into the morning's work. 3 guns, Mrs. Bland said without looking up. Needs a good lunch. They will be in the north field until midday. Cold enough for it today, Ilara said. Cold enough. Sit down. She sat. Your father is in a good mood, Mrs. Bland said, better than last week. Having a guest does that. Having this particular guest does that. Your father thinks it is going well. Ilara accepted her tea. She thought about how to say the next thing, and then decided simply to say it. Mrs. Bland, did you know that Graves's invoices for the maintenance work have been sent to 3 different suppliers but all paid into accounts in the same town? Mrs. Bland set down the thing she had been doing and looked at Alara with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something close to the relief that comes when someone finally says out loud a thing you have been unsure whether to say. I had wondered, Mrs. Bland said slowly, about the suppliers. There is a supplier listed for the window repairs last year. I arranged the work myself. The man who came was local, but the name on the invoice was from out east. Yes, Alara said, I know. They looked at each other for a moment. What are you going to do with it? Mrs. Bland said. I am not certain yet, Alara said. I am waiting for the right way to present it. Mrs. Bland looked at her for another moment, and then turned back to her work. The Duke, she said, not as a question. Possibly. He is a careful man. Yes, Alara said. That is why. She finished her tea. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and read through the notebook one more time, not because she needed to, but because she found that reading through something she had built carefully had a particular quality of steadiness that she found useful before she expected something to happen. She read every page. She closed it. She was ready. The question was, when the moment came, would she have the courage to speak? She sat with this question for a long time and found that it did not frighten her the way she might have expected it to. What she found instead was a kind of cleanness. She had been quiet at this table for years. She had been quiet for a reason. The reason was not that she had nothing to say. The reason was that she had been waiting to say the right thing at the right time to the right person. That person was in the North Field. He would be back at lunch. She looked out the window at the gray November morning and the bare elm trees and the long flat field beyond. She thought, today or tomorrow. She thought, I am not afraid. She was not afraid. She was completely certain of what she knew. And certainty, she had found, was its own form of courage. She put the notebook back in the wardrobe. She straightened her dress. She went to help her mother arrange the lunch table. And at precisely 12:30, the sound of boots on the front steps came through the hall, and the dogs barked once and were told to be quiet, and the door opened, and the men came in from the cold. She was standing at the dining room door when they came in. The Duke looked at her as he passed, in the way she was beginning to recognize as his way of looking at things, completely, without hurry. He was cold from the morning. There was a slight color in his face from the wind. He looked, in this unmanaged moment of coming in from outside into warmth, more like a real person than he did across a drawing room. She looked back. She thought, today. She thought, it will be today. She held the door and let them into the dining room, and her father was already talking about the morning's results, with the enthusiasm of a man who has had a good few hours outdoors, and Oliver was taking off his coat, and Frederick, who had not gone out that morning, was already at the table with a bread roll. She took her seat. She waited. And halfway through the lunch, her father said something about the account books, said them with that same comfortable pride he had deployed at the first supper, the pride of a man who does not know what he does not know. And the Duke glanced up from his plate, and his eyes moved briefly to Alara. Not long, a second, less than a second, but she had been waiting for it. She said quietly, without turning her head, "They are not in excellent order, actually." The table went quiet. Every head turned. Her father looked at her with the beginning of the particular expression she knew well, the slightly irritated look that meant the topic was about to be closed. But the Duke was looking at her, and the quality of that look was different from any look she had received at this table in her life. He said, "What do you mean, Miss Ashford?" He was not asking to be polite. He was asking because he wanted to know. She looked at her father for one moment. She looked at Oliver. She looked at Frederick. Then she looked at the Duke, and she said, "I can show you, if you would like to see." The table was very still. Her father said her name, once, in the voice that meant no. But the Duke had already set down his fork. "Yes," he said, "I think I would." And Alara Ashford reached the moment she had been building toward for 6 years, and she was not afraid, and she was not small, and she had everything she needed to say exactly what she was about to say. She pushed back her chair. "Then come with me," she said. And she stood up. She led him to the small library. Not to her father's study, which would have been her father's ground, and not to the drawing room, which was too public and too formal. The library was her territory. She had spent more hours in it than any other person in this house. She knew where every book sat on every shelf. She knew the angle of light from the window at different times of day. She knew that the chair by the writing table was the most comfortable for sustained reading, and that the one near the door had a slightly uneven leg that caused it to tilt if you sat in it a certain way. She had chosen the library not from sentiment, but because it was the right room for what she was about to do, which was show someone something carefully and completely, without interruption. Her father had followed them into the hall. He said her name again, in the voice that was no longer just the irritated closing voice, but something harder, something that had a crack of actual alarm in it, which she understood and was sorry for, but could not, now, stop. She turned to him and said, clearly and without apology, "I have found something important in your accounts, Father. Something that needs to be addressed. Duke Voss has the experience to help us understand what to do. Please give me a few minutes." She had never in her life spoken to her father in this way. The sentence that came out of her mouth was polite and clear and completely calm, and it contained, inside its ordinary words, the full weight of 6 years of sitting at the end of the table and watching and knowing and saying nothing. Her father stood in the hall with his mouth not quite closed and Oliver standing just behind him with an expression that was some combination of surprise and something that was almost respect but had not quite arrived there yet. She turned and went into the library. The Duke followed. She heard her father take one step toward the library door and then stop. She did not look back. She went to the writing table, placed her hand on it, and said, "Please sit down. I am going to get the book." She went upstairs quickly. Not running, but quickly. She had prepared for this. She knew exactly what she needed. She went to her room, opened the wardrobe, lifted the 2 dresses, and took out the notebook. She also took the page of notes she had prepared 2 weeks ago, the page she had written out as a clean argument, a case laid in order from earliest evidence to most recent, from smallest amount to largest. She had written it so that a careful person could follow it without needing her to explain every step. She had written it for a reader, not for an audience. She came back downstairs. He was sitting in the chair by the writing table, the good one, which she had not directed him to specifically, but which he had chosen. He had his coat off, draped over the arm of the chair. He had not moved anything on the table, or attempted to look at anything in the room. He was simply sitting, waiting, with the quality of attention she had first noticed at supper, which was complete and without any performance of patience. He was just there. She sat across from him. She placed the notebook on the table, and then the page of notes beside it. She said, "I am going to explain what I found and how I found it, and then I am going to show you the evidence, and then you can ask me whatever you want. Is that acceptable?" "Yes," he said. She began. She had not rehearsed this, exactly. She had not stood in front of a mirror and practiced sentences. What she had done was live with the information for long enough that it had become part of how she thought, and explaining it was like explaining something she had known for years, which was easy, not because it was simple, but because she understood it completely. She started with the grain entry, which had been the first small thing she noticed, and which she explained briefly, because it was not the main point, but showed the pattern. She moved to the maintenance accounts, the Western section entries, the 3 fictional supplier names. She explained the handwriting comparison. She described the town, the address similarity, what this meant about the origin of the invoices. She presented the total figure. Then she moved to the loan document, which she described from memory, accurately, because she had read it twice, and her memory for numbers and documents was reliable. She explained what the loan meant in the context of the estate's income position, the drainage field, the western boundary. She did not speak quickly. She spoke at the pace of someone who is certain of what they are saying and who understands that precision matters more than speed. She stopped at the end of each section and asked if he had questions before she continued. Each time he said no, he was listening with his whole face, the same way he had listened in the drawing room, the same way he had watched the house from the driveway, not performing attention but actually attending. When she finished, the room was quiet. He looked at the notebook. He said, "May I?" She pushed it across the table. He opened it. He turned to the first relevant page, which she had marked with a small fold at the corner, and he began to read. She watched him read. He turned pages with deliberate care, reading fully before he moved, going back once or twice to check something against an earlier page. He spent the longest time on the section with the handwriting comparisons, where she had written out the specific letters she had used to identify the common hand, with small notes about the distinguishing features. He said, without looking up, "This is from your own observation, the handwriting comparison?" "Yes," she said. "I have a strong eye for it. I can describe the specific qualities I observed, if that would help." "Tell me about the lowercase r," he said. She described it, the particular way the second stroke of the r in this hand curled inward rather than ending flat, and how this specific variant appeared consistently across all 3 fictional supplier names in all 11 invoices she had examined. He looked at her. He said, "How long have you been reading your father's accounts?" She said, 6 years. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it shifted, the way something shifts in a well-made door when the mechanism catches exactly as it should. A small, precise click of recognition. He said, "He does not know." "No," she said, "he does not." "Why not?" She considered the question. She had considered it many times herself. She said, "Because I needed to know what I had before I could decide who should have it, and I needed to understand, before I gave it to anyone, whether the person I gave it to would be able to do something with it." He was quiet for a moment. "And your father would not have been able to do something with it," he said. It was not quite a question. "He would have spoken to Graves," she said. "Graves would have offered an explanation. The explanation would have been accepted." "You sound certain of this." "I am certain of this," she said. "I have watched my father manage information that contradicts what he wishes to believe for 22 years. I know how he handles it." The Duke looked at the notebook again. He turned back to the beginning. He read a section she had not directed him to, the first page, which was her initial entry from more than a year ago, the first number she had found, the 480 pounds. He looked at the date she had written in the margin. "Over a year ago," he said. "Yes." "You have held this for over a year." "I held it until someone sat in this house who was in a position to act on it," she said. "That has not been a long wait by my standards." He looked up at her then, and there was, in his expression, something she could not quite categorize. It was not pity, which she would have found insulting. It was not admiration exactly, which felt too easy a word for it. It was the particular expression of someone who has just understood something about the shape of another person's life, and who is processing what that understanding means. He said, "What do you want me to do with this?" She said, "Graves needs to be confronted. But not by my father alone. If my father confronts him alone, without a witness whose interest in the truth is independent of his need to believe in his own good judgment, Graves will talk his way out of it. If you are present, if you have seen the evidence yourself, then the confrontation becomes something Graves cannot manage." He said, "You want me to be the witness. I want you to be the person in the room who already knows what is true," she said. "That is different from a witness. A witness observes. I want you to be someone who understands, so that when Graves provides an explanation, you are able to say, clearly, why the explanation does not hold." He considered this for a moment. "And after?" he said. "After," she said, "my father's estate will be in a considerably cleaner condition, and he will need help putting it back in order, and the Western field will have been confirmed, through an honest accounting, as a liability that is costing more than it is generating, and he will need someone to talk to about what to do with it." The Duke was quiet again. "You have thought this through," he said. "I have had a year," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. A very small movement at the corner of his mouth. He looked down at the notebook one more time. He ran his finger down a column of her figures, not checking them, she thought, but feeling the weight of them, the amount of time they represented, the precision of them. He said, "These figures, I would like to verify them against the original ledgers. Of course, she said. I can show you the relevant pages. Now. She looked at him. She thought about her father in the hall. Her father, who was almost certainly standing outside the library door, or had been, at least, until he had gone somewhere to contain his feelings about what his daughter had just done at his dining room table in front of a guest. Not this moment, she said. This evening. After supper. When the house is settled, I can take you to the study. He nodded. He closed the notebook. He placed it on the table between them, and left it there, which she understood to mean, this is yours. I am not taking it from you. I am asking to work alongside what you have built. She thought, he understands what this is. She thought, he is the right person. She picked up the notebook. She said, I should go back to the table. Yes, he said. So should I. They both rose. At the door, he paused. He said, Miss Ashford. She turned. He said, the work you have done here. The time you have spent. The care of it. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with the same kind of deliberation he had shown in choosing the right chair, the right time to come down from the carriage. It is exceptional work, he said. I want you to know that I understand that. She stood at the library door. She had been told many things across many years about what she was and was not capable of, and most of those things had arrived at this end of the table or that end of the hall, or in the particular careful tones of a family that had decided what story she belonged to. This was the first time in her memory that someone had used the word exceptional to describe anything she had done. She said, thank you. She said it quietly and without drama, because it was not a moment for drama. It was a moment for acknowledgement and for moving forward with what came next. She opened the library door. Her father was not in the hall. She and the Duke walked back to the dining room, and Frederick was still eating, and Oliver had poured more wine, and her mother was sitting with the careful composure she always maintained, and her father was in his chair, at the head of the table, with his face composed into something that was trying very hard to be ordinary. She took her seat at the far end. She picked up her fork. She ate her lunch. And for the first time in 6 years, the table did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. The afternoon passed with the particular weight of things that have been set in motion but have not yet arrived. Her father said nothing to her directly after lunch. Oliver said nothing. Her mother came to find her in the library at 3 o'clock, under the pretense of asking whether she would like to walk in the garden before the light went, and Alara said yes, because a walk with her mother in the garden was one of the easier things in a day that was full of things that were not easy. They walked the south path. The ground was hard with frost. The light was low already, that pale November late afternoon light that turns everything slightly golden, even when the day is cold. Her mother walked with her hands folded at her waist, which was her cold weather posture, dignified and self-contained. They walked in silence for a while. Then her mother said, Your father is upset. I know, Alara said. He felt contradicted in front of a guest. I know that too. Her mother was quiet for a step or two. Is it true? She said. What you showed the Duke. Is it true, what you told him? Alara said, yes. Every number. Every entry. Graves has been taking money from this estate for at least a year and a half. The amount I can confirm is over £4,000. There may be more. Her mother stopped walking. Alara stopped too. Her mother stood on the frosty path with the bare elm trees behind her, and looked at her daughter with an expression that was quite unlike any expression Alara had seen on her face before. It was not the composed and careful look. It was not the politely neutral look. It was the look of someone who has just been told something that changes the entire map of the last 2 years. 4,000, her mother said. And 210, Alara said. Her mother started walking again, very slowly. That is why, she said, after a moment. Why what? That is why things have felt tight. I noticed. Last winter. The heating coal. The staff expenses. I thought perhaps your father had made some investment. He did not tell me. She paused. He never tells me. Alara said nothing. And you have known this for a year, her mother said. I have been building the case for a year, Alara said. Knowing something is not the same as having enough to present it. Her mother turned to look at her. You were waiting for the Duke, she said. I was waiting for the right person, Alara said. He happened to be the right person. Her mother looked at her for a long moment with that unfamiliar expression. Then she turned, and they walked on. At the end of the south path, where it turned toward the garden wall, her mother said very quietly, Your father should have seen it himself. Yes, Alara said. He should have. Yes. They turned the corner. You have done this, her mother said, for this house, for this family. I have done it because it needed to be done, Alara said. Her mother said nothing more on the subject. They walked back to the house in the fading afternoon light, and when they came in from the cold, her mother touched Alara's arm once, briefly, at the door. Just a touch. No words. But it was the first time her mother had reached for her in that way in a very long time, and Alara registered it, quietly, the way she registered everything that was important. Inside. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk until supper. She was not nervous. She was ready. At supper, the table had a careful, slightly heightened quality. Her father was composed, in the way he was composed when he was managing something he had not yet decided how to manage. Oliver was quieter than usual, which was notable, because Oliver was almost never quiet by choice. Frederick ate steadily, and watched everyone with the expression of someone who could sense a change in the weather, without understanding what the change meant. Her mother was precise and gracious as always. The Duke was calm. Alara ate, and said very little, and listened to everything. After supper, when the family had dispersed in the usual directions, the Duke appeared in the doorway of the library where she was waiting, and she said, Are you ready? He said, Yes. She led him down the hall to her father's study. She had a candle. The study fire had not been lit, and the room was cold and dark until she found the lamp on the desk and lit it. The lamp threw a warm circle over the desk, and the shelves, and the two chairs that faced each other across the work surface. She opened the filing cabinet. She placed the relevant ledgers on the desk. She placed the relevant invoices on the desk beside them. For the next 2 hours, she walked him through every entry she had documented, showing him, in the original records, exactly what she had described in the notebook. He read carefully. He asked precise questions. When he asked about the handwriting, she showed him the invoices side by side and indicated the specific letter forms she had identified. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said, You are right. 2 words. Very quiet. She said, I know. He said, You have also been right about the drainage field and the loan position, if I understand your father's situation correctly from the outside. The Western field issue is not what he thinks it is. No, she said. It is a liability, not an asset. He said. That changes the nature of the conversation considerably. She said. Yes. He said. Miss Ashford, I have one question that I have been holding since this afternoon, and I would like to ask it now. She waited. He said. When this is resolved, when Graves has been confronted, and the accounts are cleaned, and the estate's position is properly understood, what do you want for yourself? Not for your father, not for the estate, for you. She had not expected this question. She had not, in all her preparation, prepared for this question. She sat with it for a moment. She said, I want to do this work, not here, for a father who does not know I have been doing it. Somewhere I am asked to do it, properly, with compensation, as a professional. The Duke looked at her across the lamplight. He said, I would like to discuss that further, not tonight, but soon. She said, All right. He closed the ledger. He straightened the invoices. He straightened the invoices. He stood, and she put out the lamp and they left the study in the dark, and she went to her room, and she lay on her bed fully dressed for a long moment before she moved, looking at the ceiling in the dark. She had not known, when she sat down to her 6 years of candlelit notebooks and careful columns, that it would feel like this. She had not known what she was building toward. She had only known that she was building something, quietly, in the one space available to her, and that if she built it carefully enough, and completely enough, it would eventually be the thing the right person needed to see. She had been right. She closed her eyes. Outside, the November wind moved through the elm trees, the same sound it always made, low and continuous, like water over stone. She slept well that night. For the first time in a long time, she slept very well indeed. The meeting with Graves happened on Friday morning. Her father had been brought around to accepting the necessity of it, not easily and not quickly, but through a process that had taken two separate conversations, one with the Duke, in her father's study, in the early evening of the previous day, which she was not present for and did not need to be, and one with her mother, briefer, which she also was not present for and which she understood to have been, in its quiet way, the more decisive of the two. Her mother had said something to her father. She did not know what. She had not asked. What she knew was that when she came down for breakfast on Thursday, her father looked at her across the table, with an expression that was not the familiar irritated dismissal. It was something older and more complicated than that, something that required several different things to be true at the same time, and he was managing them imperfectly, which was the best she could hope for. He said, passing the toast rack without meeting her eyes, "Graves will be here at 10 tomorrow. We will meet him together." She said, "Yes, father." Oliver, to his credit, said nothing unpleasant. He looked at his plate. He ate his egg. He was processing something he had not been prepared to process, and was managing it, with more grace than she had given him credit for. Frederick said, "Who is Graves?" Nobody answered this. On Friday at 10 minutes before 10, she was in the study with the notebooks and the ledgers laid out in the order she had planned. The Duke was present, seated slightly to the side, not at the desk but in the chair near the wall, a position that was clearly chosen to be present without being dominant. She had set the scene herself, arranged the documents herself, chosen which pages would be open and which would be face down for later. She worked through it methodically, and when she looked up from setting the last ledger in its place, the Duke was watching her with the same quality of complete attention she had observed since the first supper. He said, "You have done this before." "No," she said, "but I prepared." "I know," he said. "I can see the preparation." Her father came in at 3 minutes past 10, and then Graves. Mr. Graves was a man of about 50, compact, well-dressed, in the manner of someone who took his position seriously, and expressed it through clothes, with a face that had the habitual settled look of someone whose authority has not been challenged in 9 years. He entered the study with the confidence of a man summoned by his employer for what he expected would be a routine administrative conversation. He saw Alara, his expression adjusted, very slightly. He saw the Duke. He saw the ledgers on the desk. The adjustment in his expression was more substantial the second time, but he controlled it well, and within the space of 2 seconds, he had returned to his habitual settled look, and he sat in the chair her father indicated, and placed his hands on his knees, and said, "Good morning, my lord." Her father said, "Graves, thank you for coming. You know my daughter, and this is Duke Voss." Graves said, "Your Grace," with perfect composure. Then her father looked at Alara. This was the moment she had imagined many times. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the raised voice, or the theatrical accusation. Those were the tools of people who needed the room to feel that something was happening. She did not need the room to feel anything. She needed the room to know something. She said, calmly, "Mr. Graves, I would like to go through several account entries with you, starting with the maintenance and improvement categories for the last 20 months. I have the ledgers here, and I have also pulled the corresponding invoices." Graves said, "Of course." He said it easily. She watched his face as he said it. A man who had been doing what he was doing with the skill and control that this operation required would have a good face. He would not show what he was thinking. But she was not looking for what he was thinking. She was looking for what he was choosing not to think, the micro-decision not to look at any particular thing, the careful placement of attention on the middle distance, the way a person holds their body when they need very much to appear at ease. She opened the first ledger. "March of last year," she said. "An entry for £160. Field maintenance, Western section. Payable to Hartwick Field Services." She slid the invoice across the desk. "Could you describe the nature of this work?" A fraction of a pause. Then, "Drainage clearance. The West Culvert, blocked with silting from the autumn rains." "I see," she said. "And when was the work carried out?" "March," he said. "As the entry states." She said, "Interesting, because I spoke to the head farm worker. A man named Edward Crow, who has been working the western section for 11 years, and he has no recollection of any drainage clearance work in March of last year, or in any of the months adjacent to March. Graves said, "Workers are not always fully aware of every contracted job." Edward Crow, she said, is fully aware of everything that happens on the western section. He has confirmed this to me directly. There was no drainage clearance in March. Graves said, "Perhaps the contractor accessed from the road rather than through the field." "The west culvert," she said, "is not accessible from the road." A pause. She opened the second ledger page. "May of last year," she said. Another entry. £160. Field maintenance, western section. Payable to Bridewell Agricultural Works. She placed the second invoice on the desk. "Mr. Graves, would you read the address of Hartwick Field Services from the first invoice?" He read it. "And the address of Bridewell Agricultural Works from the second?" He read it. "Both companies operate from the same town," she said. "Different streets, but the same town." She paused. "I am going to ask you to look at something, and I would like you to look carefully. The handwriting on the letterhead of the first invoice, and the handwriting on the letterhead of the second. Take as much time as you need." Graves looked at the invoices. She watched his hands. His hands were still. That was good control. But his knuckles were slightly paler than the rest of his hands, which meant he was pressing them against his thighs more firmly than he had been 30 seconds ago. He said, "The handwriting appears similar. That may simply be a common style in that region." She said, "The handwriting is identical. The specific formation of the lowercase letter R, the join between I and the following vowel, the pen lift pattern in the word services. These are not stylistic similarities. They are the marks of a single writer writing under two different names." Graves said, "I cannot speak to the handwriting analysis of contractors' correspondence." "No," she said, "but you can speak to the fact that when I made inquiries in that town, there is no registered trading address for Hartwick Field Services and no registered trading address for Bridewell Agricultural Works, and the street names listed on these invoices do not correspond to any street in that town." The room was quiet. Her father's face had gone through several stages in the last few minutes. It had gone through a period of visible discomfort at watching his daughter conduct this, through something that was beginning to look like comprehension, through something that was beginning to look like a kind of pale, slow anger that had not yet found its direction. The Duke sat very still in his chair. Graves said, "I believe there may have been some administrative confusion with this supplier." She said, "I have found 3 such suppliers. I have verified that none of them exist. I have calculated the total transferred to these non-existent suppliers across the past 18 months. Would you like me to tell you the number, Mr. Graves?" Graves said nothing. £4,210, she said. The number sat in the room. Her father made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The sound a person makes when they understand something for the first time that they should have understood a long time ago. Graves said, "I would need to review the records in full before I could respond to any specific accusation." The Duke spoke for the first time. He said, "You are not being invited to review the records, Mr. Graves. You are being informed that the records have already been reviewed, thoroughly and carefully, over an extended period, by someone whose attention to detail in these matters is, I can tell you from personal observation, exceptional." He paused. He said, "The question now is not whether the evidence exists. The question is what Lord Ashford chooses to do with it." Graves looked at her father. Her father looked at Graves. She had known, going into this room, that the outcome of this conversation depended on her father's willingness to face what she was showing him. She had spent a long time thinking about this variable. A man who had trusted someone for 9 years and been systematically deceived for 18 months of those 9 years was a man who had to reckon with 2 painful things simultaneously: the deception itself and his failure to have seen it. These 2 things, arriving together, created a particular kind of distress that could go in either direction. It could produce denial, because denial was easier than accepting both, or it could produce the kind of cold, clarifying anger that arrives when a person decides that the pain of not acting is greater than the pain of acting. She had not been certain which direction her father would choose. She knew now. Lord Edmund Ashford looked at his steward of 9 years, and he said, in a voice she had never heard him use before, a voice from which all the habitual warmth and formality of a country landowner had been entirely removed. "Get out of my house." 3 words. Very quiet. Graves sat still for a moment. Then he stood. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. He had understood, from the moment Ilara began the first sentence, that the person in front of him had built a case that could not be argued away, and the only question had been how long it would take the other people in the room to understand the same thing. It had not taken long. He walked to the door. He opened it. He left. The door clicked shut. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then her father put his hands flat on the desk and looked at the ledgers and the invoices that were still spread out in front of him, and he looked at them for a long time, and then he looked at Ilara. He said, £4,210. "Yes," she said. "That is what I can confirm. There may be earlier amounts I have not yet traced." He said, "And you knew this for a year?" She said, "I had the evidence for a year. The case took longer." He was quiet. She waited. He said, "How did you learn to do this?" She said, "I taught myself, with your account books." He looked at her as though he was seeing something that had been in front of him for a long time, and that he was only now choosing to look at directly. He said, "I see." He did not say anything else for a while. The Duke stood, quietly. He said he would give them a moment and stepped out of the room, and the door clicked shut again, and she was alone with her father for the first time, and she could not say how long, in any meaningful sense of the word alone. Her father looked at the ledgers. He looked at the window. He looked at her. He said, "I owe you an apology, Ilara." She was quiet. He said, "Not only for this, for a great many things, for a long time." She did not say, "Yes, you do." She did not say anything dramatic. She said, "Thank you, Father." He nodded. He looked at his hands. She began to close the ledgers. They had work to do. The days that followed the confrontation with Graves had a particular quality that Ilara found difficult to name precisely. The house felt different, not because anything in it had changed physically. The chandelier was still dull. The chairs were still in the same places. The supper bell still rang at 7. But the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was subtle and comprehensive, the way the air inside a room shifts when a window is finally opened after a long winter. Her father was subdued in a way she had not seen before. He was not broken by it. He was a man of considerable inner stubbornness, and the stubbornness now seemed to be working in a different direction than it usually did. Rather than defending against what had happened, he was directing himself toward the problem of recovering from it. She saw this in the way he sat at his desk for longer hours than usual, in the way he asked, for the first time in her memory, to see the records she had kept, not to verify them, but to understand them, to understand what she had seen and how she had seen it. She sat with him twice in the study that week. She explained the methods. He listened. He asked questions that were, she noted, much better questions than she had expected, questions that showed a sharper mind than she had given him credit for, a mind that had been applied for many years to the wrong things or to a partial view of things, but which was capable of focus when it chose to focus. She found that she did not feel triumphant in these sessions. She felt something simpler, something that was close to grief and close to relief at the same time, the feeling of a thing that has been held for a long time, finally being set down, and the discovery that your arms ache in the places where you have been holding it. The Duke stayed for his full planned visit, and then 2 days beyond it. He was useful in these extra days in a practical way, suggesting connections to a solicitor in the county town who handled property disputes involving fraud, offering from his own experience of estate management the specific language needed to formally contest the money that Graves had removed, and to recover what could be recovered. He spoke with her father directly, the two of them in the study, on 2 separate occasions. On both occasions, her father emerged looking like a man who has had a heavy object lifted off him that he did not know he was carrying. On the final evening of the extended visit, after supper, when Oliver and Frederick had retired and her mother was in the sitting room with her letters, her father was in his study, and Ilara and the Duke were the only 2 people in the drawing room, something that had come about not by arrangement, but simply because there was nowhere else in the house at that hour, with a fire and a lamp and the right quality of quiet, He was reading. She was doing something with the household accounts notebook she had asked to look through earlier in the day, making notes in her own small handwriting in the margins where she saw things worth following up. The fire was low. He said, without looking up from his book, "I have been thinking about the conversation we had in the library. What you said you wanted." She looked up. He said, "I meant what I said in return, that I wanted to discuss it further." She waited. He looked up now. He said, "My estate accounts are managed by a factor named Mr. Halton, who has held the position for 6 years, and who is, as far as I have been able to determine, honest and reasonably capable. But reasonably capable is not the same as exceptional, and I have known for some time that certain aspects of the accounts, specifically the capital improvement categories, which as I noted at your father's supper table are the most complex and the most vulnerable to mismanagement, are not being handled with the level of scrutiny I would want." She said, "You would like someone to audit them." "I would like someone to review them systematically," he said, "and to continue reviewing them. Not a single audit. Ongoing oversight. Someone whose understanding of accounts is strong enough that problems do not go undetected for 18 months. She said, "You are describing a professional position." "Yes," he said, "with a formal arrangement, a specific responsibility, compensation, commensurate with the value of the work." She set down her pen. She said, "I have no professional credentials. I have never formally studied accounts or estate management." "You have 6 years of self-directed study in a real estate's accounts," he said, "and you have demonstrated, in the last 4 days, a level of analytical precision and methodical rigor that no credential would have given you, and that most credentialed people do not possess. The question of whether your knowledge counts as professional is a question of convention. I am not bound by convention if the convention is producing a worse outcome than the alternative." She looked at him. She said, "My father's reaction, and the reaction of others in this county, to a woman holding a formal professional position of this kind, would not be straightforward." "I am aware of that," he said. "My own position within this family would become more complicated, not less." "That is also likely true," he said. "And yet you are proposing it." "I am proposing it," he said, "because it is the correct thing to do. And because I believe you will be very good at it, and because, frankly, I cannot afford to have my maintenance accounts in the hands of someone who is less than exceptional, which is what I currently have, and which, as the last week has demonstrated, is an expensive compromise." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I would want to review your existing accounts before I agreed to anything. The complete records. Everything Mr. Halton has handled." "Of course," he said. "I would want to understand the full scope of the estate's position, income, expenditure, capital items, loans, all of it. I would provide everything you asked for. And the arrangement would need to be formal, written, specific about responsibilities, and about compensation. I would expect nothing less," he said. She looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about what this meant. She thought about what it would look like from the outside, and what it would feel like from the inside. She thought about the table at Ashford Hall, and the end seat that had been her geography for so many years. She thought about the notebooks she had kept, the years of careful invisible work that had had nowhere to go. She thought about the word exceptional. She thought, this is the right moment, and the right person, and the right question, and if I am afraid of it, then I have not been building toward this at all. I have simply been waiting for someone to come and tell me to stay where I am. She said, "I would like to accept the proposal. In principle, subject to seeing the records." He said, "That is all I asked." She said, "Yes." He went back to his book. She went back to her notes. The fire burned lower. The house was quiet around them. And in the small, contained space of that drawing room, with the cold November night outside and the warm lamplight inside, Elara Ashford sat with her pen in her hand and her notebook open on her knee and thought about what came next. What came next was work. Real work. Her own. She turned a page of the notebook and wrote, "Voss Estate Accounts. Review all capital improvement categories. Check handwriting on all contractor invoices from last 4 years. Compare against field records and staff reports." Then she stopped and looked at what she had written and felt something she had not felt in the study at Ashford Hall, not in 6 years of careful invisible effort. She felt, for the first time, like herself. The version of herself that had been waiting, patiently, and without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this. She bent her head over the notebook. She began to write. She arrived at the Voss estate on a Monday in early December, in a carriage her father had arranged without her asking, which was the first practical signal she received that something in the Ashford household had shifted in ways that were going to take time to fully understand. The burrito was cold. The Voss estate was called Aldenmere, and it sat on the western side of the county, on land that ran between a slow river to the south and a long ridge of limestone to the north. She had looked at the name on a county map in her father's study years before, and thought, a serious piece of land. Now, coming through the gates on the winter morning, she saw it for the first time directly, and understood that she had been right. It was not showy. It was not built to impress. It was a working estate, visible as working, in the way that a set of hands is visible as working, by its wear and its purpose, and the evidence everywhere, of things being done and maintained, and improved over time. The house itself was larger than Ashford Hall, but not grander in the self-conscious way that some houses were grand. It was solid. It had been added to in different periods, and the additions were different in style but not inharmonious, as if each generation had built what it needed, and had had the sense not to tear down what was still useful. She liked it immediately. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Carver, received her at the door with the measured warmth of someone who had been told to expect an unusual arrival and had decided to manage it with professionalism. She was shown to a room in the east wing, comfortable and clean, and furnished with the functional qualities she was beginning to recognize as the aesthetic of this whole estate. Nothing unnecessary, nothing cheap, everything chosen for use. The Duke met her in the study at noon. The study at Aldenmere was 3 times the size of her father's study at Ashford Hall, and considerably more organized. The shelves were labeled. The filing was systematic. The desk was large and very clear, with only what was currently in use sitting on its surface. She looked around the room, before she sat down and registered everything. He set the first ledger in front of her without preamble. The capital improvement accounts for the last 4 years, he said. Everything Mr. Halton has managed. She opened it. She spent the first 2 hours reading. Not interrogating. Not looking for anything specific yet. Reading, the way she always read numbers the first time, to get the shape, to understand the overall scale, the rhythms of the expenditure, where the money moved and how often, and in what categories, and at what times of year. He left her alone to do this, which she appreciated. He came back with tea at some point, set it on the edge of the desk without comment, and left again. She drank the tea, without fully registering that she had done so. By the end of the second hour she had seen the shape. And the shape was interesting. The Voss estate accounts were, broadly speaking, in good order. Mr. Halton was not Graves. He was not dishonest, at least not in any way she had found yet. He was, however, as the Duke had described him, only reasonably capable, and the specific thing he was least capable of was what the Duke had identified, the capital improvement categories. Not because he was taking money, but because he was not interrogating the invoices he paid. He was accepting what was submitted to him. He was a man who trusted suppliers and contractors because trusting them was easier than checking them, and in an honest world this would have been sufficient, and might have been fine indefinitely. But in the real world, even in an otherwise well-managed estate, the absence of scrutiny was an invitation, not necessarily an accepted invitation, but an open door. She found, by the end of the first day, 3 invoices that did not correspond to any work she could independently verify from the staff records that the Duke had also made available to her. These were not large amounts. The largest was £80, but they were unexplained, and unexplained was the word she cared about. She also found a pattern she had not expected. In the livestock management categories, there was a consistent small discrepancy between the recorded purchase prices and what she calculated, from comparison with known regional market prices, should have been the range for the relevant stock at the relevant time. The differences were small, but they were consistently in the same direction. Someone connected to the livestock purchasing was adding a small margin to the transactions that was not going to the sellers. This was not what she had come to find, but she had found it. She wrote it down. She went to supper. The Duke was at supper alone, which she had not expected. She had imagined, from the scale of the house, that there would be family, or guests, or at minimum a fuller household. There was, she would learn over the coming days, a sister in London, and a cousin who visited seasonally, and a mother who lived in the Voss family's older property in the south. But on a Monday evening in December, the dining room held only 2 of them, and the table was set for 2 without any of the performative minimizing that a smaller table at Ashford Hall would have involved. "How was the reading?" he asked. "Useful," she said. He served himself, and did not ask further. She appreciated this too. She was beginning to compile a mental list of things about this man that she appreciated, which was a list she was aware of keeping, and which she had decided to keep without apology, because appreciating specific things about a specific person was simply accurate observation, and accurate observation was how she understood the world. "I found 3 invoices I cannot verify," she said, after the soup, "and a pattern in the livestock accounts that will need investigating." He looked up. "The livestock accounts," he said slowly. "Tell me." She described it. The small, consistent margin above expected market price. The direction of the discrepancy. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I have wondered about Colin Birch." "Who is Colin Birch?" "The man who manages the livestock purchases. He has been in that position for 3 years. He was highly recommended. I have had no specific reason to doubt him." She said, "The pattern I am describing would suggest that the doubt is warranted." He said, "I had a feeling. I could not quantify it." She said, "I can quantify it. I will need 2 more days in those records." He said, "Take whatever you need." They ate in a comfortable working silence that she found, to her mild surprise, not uncomfortable at all. She was not accustomed to silence at supper that felt like something other than her own invisibility. This silence felt different. It felt like 2 people who were in the middle of a shared project and were using the meal as a brief pause in it, not as a performance or a social ritual, but as a genuine rest before continuing. She said, after the main course, "Your estate is in considerably better health than my father's." "I have been relatively attentive," he said, though apparently not attentive enough.
"Relatively attentive is better than the alternative," she said. "The problems I have found so far are containable. The livestock margin is a recoverable issue."
The unverified invoices may be genuine items with missing paperwork, or they may not be. Either way, the damage is not catastrophic. Unlike the Ashford situation, he said. The Ashford situation went undetected because nobody was looking, she said. That is the entire nature of it. The detecting is not difficult. It requires attention and method. What is needed is someone whose specific purpose is to pay that attention and apply that method. Which is precisely why you are here, he said. Yes, she said. She looked at her plate and then at the room. It was a good room, well proportioned. The fire was well tended. The light was honest, not the dull brownish light of her father's chandelier, but a clean, warm lamplight that made the table surface and the glasses and the plates look as they actually were. She said, "How long has Aldenmuir been in your family?" 4 generations, he said, "the same as your family's time at Ashford Hall." "Your management philosophy is different from my father's," she said. "Yes," he said. "When did you begin to involve yourself directly in the accounts?" "When I was 23, he said. "My father died that year. I took the estate before I was ready, in the conventional sense. I could not afford not to understand what I was taking." She said, "You taught yourself." "With considerably more help than you had," he said. "I had a good factor in the first 2 years, who was willing to teach, and I had time, and no one telling me I should not be doing it." She said, "That is a meaningful difference." He said, "Yes, I am aware of it." They were quiet for a moment. She said, "The work here will take approximately 2 weeks to complete a thorough initial review. After that, a monthly review going forward would be sufficient to maintain the oversight I would recommend. I would also suggest quarterly interviews with the heads of each department, brief, structured, focused on flagging any unusual items before they enter the accounts rather than after." He said, "That sounds excellent." She said, "I will write it up formally at the end of the 2 weeks. A full report, with recommendations, and then a proposed structure for the ongoing arrangement." He said, "I would expect nothing less." She said, I will also need to discuss the formal terms of the arrangement before the end of the 2 weeks. Of course, he said. I will have my solicitor draw up a letter of engagement. You can review it and suggest whatever amendments you feel are necessary. She said, I will feel several amendments are necessary. He looked at her. He almost smiled, the same almost smile she had seen in the library at Ashford Hall, the small movement at the corner of his mouth. I expected no less, he said. She picked up her fork. She ate. The fire crackled. Outside the dining room windows, the December night had settled fully over the estate, and the fields and the limestone ridge and the slow river to the south were invisible in the dark, and the only light was inside, where two careful people ate supper together across a table and discussed the work that lay ahead, and neither of them made it into anything other than what it was, which was work, and which was therefore, for both of them, in different ways, exactly what they had always wanted. She had a second portion of the roasted parsnip. She had not had anyone offer her a second portion of anything at a table in a very long time. She accepted it without making anything of it. She ate. The second week at Aldenmere deepened the picture. She worked through the livestock accounts with the same methodical patience she had brought to her father's books, but now in a room that was lit properly and warm, and where the ledgers were organized in a way that made the work faster, not because the work required less attention, but because the system she was working through was consistent enough that she could move through it with the steady rhythm of someone following a well-laid path. She found what she had predicted she would find. The livestock margin pattern was not new. It went back further than 3 years, which meant it had started under a previous purchasing manager, whose records she would need to request. But she had enough in the current 3-year period to establish the pattern clearly and calculate the accumulated amount. It was a smaller number than the Graves situation, 940 pounds across 3 years, spread thin enough that it had never triggered any review, never risen to a level that produced an obvious anomaly in the yearly totals. A careful, invisible theft. Not dramatic, not ambitious, just persistent. She found also, in the final days of her review, one more unverified invoice that she had initially thought might be legitimate, but which, on closer examination, had no matching work record anywhere in the estate documents. This one was in the fencing and boundary maintenance category, 235 pounds, 5 years old. She flagged it separately, because its age meant it fell in a different administrative period, and the question of recovery was different. She wrote it all down. She organized the notes into a report that was 23 pages long, clear, structured, and specific. She wrote it the same way she had written her case for her father's situation. Not for drama, not for effect, but for use. Every claim supported by the relevant entry and invoice reference. Every calculation shown, every recommendation explained by the problem it addressed. On the last evening of her planned 2-week stay, she placed the report on the desk in the Duke's study and sat across from him while he read it. He read every page. When he had finished, he set it down and sat back. He said, "This is the clearest account analysis I have seen." She said, "I have had a good deal of practice." He said, "I know, that is part of what I mean." He looked at the report. "The livestock situation with Birch. I will need to handle this through the land agent. What is your recommendation for approach?" She said, "Present him with the pattern and the figures, and give him one opportunity to explain them. If the explanation does not account for the discrepancy, dismiss him and report the matter. Do not negotiate. The pattern is clear enough that any negotiation would simply be expensive ambiguity." He said, "Yes, I agree." He picked up the last page, which contained her proposed structure for ongoing oversight. He read it again. He said, "Monthly review, quarterly interviews, and you would need access to the full accounts on each visit." "Yes," she said. "Every category. I will not review maintenance accounts separately from livestock accounts, separately from household accounts. The pattern of mismanagement, when it exists, often involves movement between categories that conceals itself if each category is reviewed in isolation. That is a practice I had not considered," he said. "Most people do not consider it," she said, "which is why it works." He nodded. He set the report down. He said, "The letter of engagement from my solicitor arrived this morning. I left it with the terms column blank, because I thought you should state the terms. She said, I would like to do that now, if you are willing. He said, of course. She told him her terms, not asking, stating. She had prepared them in the same way she prepared everything, which was carefully and completely, and without any ambiguity about what she meant. She named a specific monthly fee. She named the specific access she required. She described the reporting structure. She described what she would provide and when. She described what she would not do, which was agree to any arrangement that reduced her independence or required her findings to be filtered through any intermediary before they reached him. He listened to every point. He said, I accept all of it. She said, all of it? He said, yes. Your terms are reasonable, and your requirements are necessary for the work to be what it needs to be. I have no interest in compromising either. She said, my father's solicitor will need to see the letter before I sign it. He said, that is entirely appropriate. She said, he will not understand all of it. He almost smiled. No, he said, probably not, but he should see it regardless. Yes, she said. She sat back. She looked at the report on the desk, 23 pages of work that was hers, built from scratch, in a room where nobody had told her to sit, and nobody had expected anything in particular of her. She thought about the 6 years at the end of the Ashford table. She thought about the candle burning down. She thought about the notebook under the dresses in the wardrobe, the plain cloth-covered book that had started as a private act of careful attention and had become, in the end, the thing that had brought her here. She thought about her mother's hand on her arm at the garden door. She thought about what it meant to be in this room, in this estate, doing this work, as herself, with a formal arrangement and a fee and 23 pages of evidence that she was the right person to be doing it. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she would not have wanted to cry here, in front of this man, in this room. But she felt, in the place behind her sternum where large things tended to land before they spread to the rest of her, the weight of 6 years setting down. It had a very particular feeling, this weight setting down. It did not feel like triumph. It did not feel like relief, exactly, though it was close to that. It felt like accuracy, like a calculation arriving at the correct number, like the world arranging itself into the shape it should have been in for a very long time, and the satisfaction of that not being about winning, but about correctness. She said, I will be back in 3 weeks. He said, I will have everything you need ready. She stood. She extended her hand. He stood and shook it, the way two people shake hands on an agreement, firmly and without ceremony. She picked up her copy of the report. She said, Good night, Duke Voss. He said, Good night, Miss Ashford. She walked to the door. At the door she paused, not because she had anything else to say, but because she wanted to see the room one more time before she left it. The organized shelves, the labeled files, the clear desk with the lamp, the report, her report. She turned and walked down the corridor to her room. She packed her things. She was ready to go home. And for the first time in her memory, she was also ready to come back. The letter from the Hartley family arrived on a morning in January, addressed to her father but enclosing a separate note specifically for her, which her father brought to the breakfast table and placed beside her plate without comment, which was itself a small event worth noting. She opened the note. Sir Henry Hartley was a property owner whose estate, Dunmore Park, sat about 12 miles south of Aldermere, far enough from Aldenmere that the two estates had no direct boundary questions but close enough that the county's social connections ran between them. She did not know Sir Henry. She knew his name from county records and from a brief mention in a letter of her father's that she had read 2 years ago and filed in her memory. He was a man of about 60, she recalled, with a substantial estate and a reputation for the kind of blunt practicality that sometimes sat alongside serious money. The note said, I have heard from Aldrich Voss about the analysis work you conducted at Aldenmere. He described your methods and findings in some detail. I would like to discuss whether a similar engagement might be appropriate for Dunmore Park. I am in no immediate crisis, but I believe, having spoken with Voss, that independent account oversight is something I have lacked for too long. Would you be willing to correspond on this subject, with a view to meeting if appropriate? She read it twice. She set it down. She picked up her toast. she thought. Word travels faster than I expected. She also thought, of course it does. These men have been neighbors for decades. They talk about land and accounts and management, the way her brothers talked about horses and hunting. If one of them found a solution to a problem that many of them had, the information would move. She thought about what this meant. One engagement, at Aldenmere, had produced a letter from a second estate. If she accepted the engagement at Dunmore Park, and if Sir Henry was connected in his turn to other property owners across the county, and if the work she produced was of the same standard as what she had produced at Aldenmere, which she had no reason to doubt, then the number of inquiries might not stop at 2. She did not make anything of this yet. She held it as information, but she held it carefully, because it was the kind of information that, properly attended to, had consequences. She wrote back to Sir Henry that afternoon. A brief letter, polite, professional, specific about her current commitments and the time she could make available. She described, in general terms, her approach, the initial full review, the formal report, the proposed structure for ongoing oversight. She named a fee range, because she had found in the arrangement at Aldenmere that stating terms clearly and early saved a great deal of time and confusion. She said she would be glad to meet at his convenience and that, if the meeting suggested a good fit, she could begin work within the month. Her father watched her write the letter. He was at his own desk, ostensibly reading something, but she could feel his attention across the room, in the particular way that attention, directed without announcement, is still felt by the person it is directed at. When she sealed the letter and set it aside to be sent, he said, "Another enquiry?" "Sir Henry Hartley," she said. "He heard about the Aldenmere work from Duke Voss." Her father said, "Hartley is a serious man. Large holding." "I gathered as much from his note," she said. Her father was quiet for a moment. He said, "You will need proper representation before long, a solicitor of your own." She looked at him. She said, "I have been thinking the same thing." He said, "Norton and Wells, in the county town. They are who I should have been using, frankly. Good firm, used to complex property arrangements." She said, "Would you write me an introduction?" He said, "Yes, I will write it today." She sat with this offer for a moment. Her father, writing her an introduction to a firm of solicitors for her own professional use. It was not, in the grand scheme of things, a large action. It was a letter. But it was the kind of letter that a year ago would not have been written, not because the need did not exist, but because nobody in this house had understood that the need existed, or that she was the person to whom the need applied. She said, "Thank you, Father." He said, "It is the least I can do." He wrote the letter. She sent hers. Sir Henry replied within 4 days, which confirmed her initial impression of him as a practical man, and they arranged to meet at Dunmore Park in the last week of January. In the 2 weeks between, she returned to Aldenmere for her first monthly review, under the formal arrangement. The letter of engagement had been signed. Her copy was in a file in her room at Ashford Hall, in a new file she had purchased for the purpose, plain, black, bearing her initials. The fee for the first month had arrived by banker's draft, which she had deposited at the county town bank in an account she had opened in her own name. Her own name, on her own account, holding money she had earned. She held this fact in her mind carefully, the way she held all the facts that mattered most to her, not celebrating it in a way that made it fragile, but acknowledging it completely, because the tendency to fail to acknowledge important things was something she had observed too much of in the people around her, and had made a quiet decision not to repeat. The monthly review at Aldenmere went smoothly. The 3 unverified invoices from her initial report had been investigated. 2 had turned out to be legitimate items with incomplete paperwork, which Mr. Halton had located eventually in a secondary file. The 3rd could not be verified, and the Duke had written to the supplier's address, which was, as she had suggested might be the case, unoccupied. The livestock situation had been addressed. Colin Birch had been presented with the figures, and had offered an explanation that was elaborate and implausible, and had been dismissed, with written notice, within the week. A replacement was being found. The Duke had reported the matter to the relevant authority. She noted all of this in her report for the month, and added 2 observations about patterns she had noticed in the household supply accounts that warranted a closer look in the following month. She was not certain they meant anything yet, but they had the slightly irregular quality of things that were worth watching. She wrote it up. She handed it to the Duke at the end of her review day. He read it at supper, which had by now become a natural and unremarkable routine. She ate. He read. They discussed. He said, "The household supply pattern. You think it may be supplier collusion?" "I think it is worth verifying," she said. "The price variance is small and could be explained by seasonal fluctuation. But it has been consistent for 5 months, and consistency in the wrong direction is the thing I watch for." "Yes," he said. She said, "I will check the regional market prices before next month's visit and compare. If the pattern holds against the market data, then we have a question worth asking." He said, "Good. Then, how are things at Ashford Hall?" She considered how to answer this. "Settling," she said. "My father has engaged a new steward, younger man, from a different county. I reviewed his references before my father made the offer." "He asked you to review them?" "Yes," she said. The Duke set down his fork. He looked at her with that complete attention. He said, "That is new." "Yes," she said, "it is." She ate her fish. He said, "And your brothers?" She said, "Oliver is finding the new situation interesting, in a way that I believe will, in time, become genuine respect. Frederick is largely unchanged. But he was always the least problematic of them, in terms of what he required of me, which was nothing in particular." The Duke smiled. A real one this time. The first full smile she had seen from him. It changed his face considerably. She looked at her plate. He said, "And you, how are you finding it? This work, being out of the house?" She said, "I am finding it exactly as I hoped. The work is what I believed it would be. The arrangements are working. There are complications I did not fully anticipate." "Such as?" "The social complications are more present than I expected," she said. "When I attended a county gathering last month with my mother, I was spoken to by 3 separate women about what I was doing at Aldenmere, and whether it was wise. The conversation was polite, but the question underneath it was not. What was the question underneath it? She said, whether a woman in my position, unmarried, working in a professional capacity in an arrangement with a single man who is also unmarried, is conducting herself appropriately. He was quiet. She said, "I am telling you this because I think you should know it is being asked. It does not affect my work, but it is a fact of my situation, and I prefer to have facts on the table." He said, "What did you say to them?" She said, "I said that the arrangement was formal, professionally documented, and conducted entirely in the context of estate management, which is true." He said, "Is that sufficient?" She said, "Not for some of them, no." He said, "I am sorry that you are managing this." "I am not asking for an apology," she said. "I am asking you to be aware of it, so that if any version of this conversation reaches you, you understand what is behind it, and can respond accordingly." He said, "I can do that." She said, "Thank you." They finished supper. In the evening, in the drawing room after supper, the same arrangement as the previous visit, fire low, lamps lit, each of them with work. She found herself, at a certain point, simply sitting without working, looking at the fire. He noticed. He was good at noticing, without drawing attention to his noticing, which was one of the qualities of his attention she had come to recognize. He said, "Are you tired?" She said, "I am not tired. I am thinking about something." He said, "What?" She said, "I am thinking about what it is to want something for a long time, and then to have it, and to discover that having it is different from what you imagined it would be. Not worse, just different." He said, "In what way is it different?" She said, "I imagined that having professional work, real work, would feel like arriving somewhere, like reaching a destination I had been moving toward." She paused. "It does not feel like that. It feels like beginning, like standing at the beginning of something, rather than at the end of something." He said, "Yes, it does feel like that." She looked at him. He said, "I felt the same at 23. When I inherited the estate, I had imagined that responsibility was a destination. It turned out to be a starting point." She said, "That is exactly the sensation." He said, "It does not diminish." She said, "Good." The fire burned. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the quarter hours. Outside, the January night was completely cold and completely still, and the estate lay in the dark doing what estates do in the middle of the night, which is breathe, slowly and without drama, held together by the accumulated effort of the people who know how it works. She thought about the beginning of something. She thought about the beginning of something. She thought about the beginning of something. She turned back to her work. She was not afraid. She had learned, over a long time in a quiet house, that the most useful quality a person could develop was not courage, in the dramatic sense, but the simpler, steadier thing that looks like patience from the outside, but is, from the inside, simply readiness. She was ready. She had been ready for 6 years. Now, finally, there was somewhere to put it. She bent her head. She worked. Sir Henry Hartley was exactly as she had expected from his letter, which was to say blunt, practical, and possessed of a directness that she found immediately easier to work with than politeness that concealed something. He received her at Dunmore Park on a cold Thursday morning, in a study that was considerably more disordered than either her father's or the Duke's, papers at various stages of completion covering the available surfaces, a fire going strongly, a dog of indeterminate age asleep in front of it. He rose when she came in, shook her hand without ceremony, and said, "I have been looking over the accounts this morning in anticipation of your visit. I must tell you, I found 3 things that troubled me before I had been looking for 20 minutes, which tells me that someone who looks with intent is going to find considerably more." She said, "That is the usual discovery, yes." He said, "Sit down. Tell me how you work." She told him. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both sharp and both useful. When she finished, he said, "When can you start?" She said, "I can begin a preliminary review today, if you have the records available. I would need 2 full days minimum before I could offer you even an initial impression." He said, "I have the records. Tea?" She said yes to the tea, and no to the biscuits, and she sat at the cleared half of the desk he had made available to her, and she began. What she found at Dunmore Park over the course of 2 days was a more complex picture than Aldenmere, not because Sir Henry's estate was worse managed, but because it was larger, and the accounts were less organized, and the record-keeping had been inconsistent across several different stewards over the past decade, each of whom had kept records in their own way, which meant that reading the full picture required building a mental map of 5 different systems and working out how they connected. She enjoyed this. She had not expected to enjoy it quite so much. The complexity was not an obstacle. It was, in the same way that a difficult calculation is an invitation to a particular kind of concentration, a pleasure. The problem was interesting. The problem required her full attention. The problem rewarded attention with information, and information, properly assembled, resolved into a picture that was either reassuring or alarming, and in either case was more useful than ignorance. What the picture at Dunmore Park resolved into, by the end of the 2nd day, was not alarming. It was messy. There were gaps in the record-keeping. There were categories where the oversight had lapsed. There were supplier relationships that had never been checked against market rates. There was no active fraud that she could identify, but there was a looseness, a comfortable trusting quality, in the account management that was the kind of soil in which fraud grew comfortably if the right person found it first. She said this to Sir Henry, at dinner, on the 2nd evening, without softer language, because he was clearly a man who preferred to hear things directly. He said, "So I am not being stolen from, but I could be." She said, "You are leaving the door open. Whether anyone walks through it depends on who you employ." He said, "What would you recommend?" She described the structure she had developed at Aldenmere: monthly review, quarterly interviews, access to all categories together rather than in isolation. He said, "And you would do this." She said, "If the engagement terms are appropriate, yes." He said, "What did Voss pay you?" She named the figure. He said, "Double it." She looked at him. He said, "I run a larger estate and a more complicated set of accounts, and I am clearly in greater need of the attention, double." She said, "I accept." He said, "Good. How soon can you give me a full report?" She said, 3 weeks. He said, 2? She said, 3. He said, "Very well." He poured more wine. He said, Voss said you had been doing this in your father's house for years, without anyone knowing. 6 years, she said. Without any payment, he said. Without any knowledge, she said. The payment was not the issue. What was the issue? She said. The issue was that I needed to understand things properly before I could do anything with what I understood. 6 years was the preparation. He looked at her over his wine glass. He said, most people would have done something with half that preparation and done it badly. She said, I know. He said, is it characteristic of you to wait that long? She said, it is characteristic of me to wait until I am ready. The length of time that requires depends on the situation. He said, useful quality. She said, I find it so. He refilled her glass without asking. She noticed that he had, a week ago, asked before refilling, but had apparently made a determination about her preferences and was now acting on it directly. She found this more comfortable than the asking. She drank her wine. She thought about 2 estates now. 2 formal arrangements, 2 sets of accounts that would benefit from the kind of attention she had been practicing in the dark for 6 years. She thought about the fee she had just agreed to, and what it meant in practical terms, and what it meant in terms of the shape of the next year. She thought, I am going to need a better system for managing my own time. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, not the accounts notebook, but a separate one she had started keeping for professional scheduling and tasks, and wrote, develop monthly schedule across both estates. Allow adequate time for each. Build in travel. Sir Henry watched her write this without comment. When she looked up, he said, is there anyone else you are planning to take on? She said, I have 2 current commitments. I will consider a third, if the timing is workable. He said, the Faro estate, east of the county, is a mess. They will never ask you. They are too proud. But they need someone. Just so you know, it is there when pride fails, as it always eventually does. She wrote, Faro, East County, future. She closed the notebook. She said, thank you for that. He said, you are good at this work. Word will spread faster than you plan for. She said, I know. He said, are you prepared for that? She said, I have been preparing for a long time. He looked at her one more time, with the straight look she was beginning to associate with practical men who had decided to take her at face value, which she had found was actually easier with men of his type, the blunt practical ones, than with the politely elaborate ones who needed to manage every interaction through a layer of convention. He said, good. He finished his wine. She finished hers. Outside the Dunmore Park windows, the January dark was the same as the dark outside every window she had looked through in this county for the past 2 months, cold and complete, and without any of the particular quality of indoor warmth where she was sitting, which was the warmth of a room where work had just been agreed, and the shape of the next chapter was clear. She had come to Dunmore Park alone, in a carriage she had arranged herself, with her own notebooks and her own pen, and a letter of introduction from the Duke that she had asked for, and that he had written without question, a short letter that said simply, I recommend Miss Ashford without qualification. Her work is thorough, her analysis is rigorous, and her integrity is beyond question. Trust what she shows you. She had read the letter before she sent it, because she had asked to read it before it was sealed, and he had said of course without blinking. She thought about that letter. She thought about the long table at Ashford Hall, and the dull chandelier, and the seat at the end, and the years of sitting in it, with information nobody knew she had, and patience nobody knew she was spending. She thought, from there to here. She thought, this is what it was for. She stood. She said, I will return in 3 weeks with the report. Sir Henry said, I look forward to it. She walked to the door. She went to her room. She slept, again, very well. In the morning, she took the carriage home across the cold county, watching the fields and the ridge and the river and the pale winter sky, and she thought about the notebook under the dresses that had started all of this, and she thought, I should keep that. Not to look at, just to have, just so it stays somewhere safe, because it is the record of where it began, and the place where something begins matters, even when you have moved far enough past it that the beginning is no longer visible from where you stand. She would keep it. She arrived home. She went upstairs. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her desk. She began the Dunmore Park report. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, and when her mother came to the door to call her for supper, she said she would be down in 10 minutes, and she was, because she had learned, in recent months, that the table at Ashford Hall was a different kind of table from the one she had grown up at, and supper there was no longer something she was attending because she had nowhere else to be. It was somewhere she chose to go. That was different. That was entirely different. She closed her notebook. She went downstairs. She sat at the table. Spring came slowly that year, arriving first in the south-facing slopes of the county, and working its way north over the course of 3 weeks, that felt longer than 3 weeks, as springs in the north sometimes do, as though the season is not entirely certain it has permission to proceed. She worked through all of it. The schedule she had built for herself across 2 estates, and then, by April, 3, was tight, but not impossible. The Farrow estate had not waited as long as Sir Henry had predicted, though it had taken not the failure of pride, but a specific crisis to move them. A crisis in the form of a land boundary dispute with a neighboring property that had produced, in the course of investigating the dispute, an examination of the relevant account records by an outside party, which had revealed something unpleasant about the Farrow estate's management of the relevant category, enough to produce, in the senior Mr. Farrow, a letter to Sir Henry, asking whether he knew anyone who could help. Sir Henry had written back recommending Alara. She had received the Farrow letter in February, and had written back in her usual way, stating terms, describing her methods, proposing a meeting. The meeting had been stiff, because Mr. Farrow was a proud man, with a recent experience of embarrassment, and not yet certain how to sit with both things simultaneously. She had allowed for this. She had been patient, not because she was required to be, but because patience was genuinely the most useful tool in rooms where people had not yet finished processing something. By the end of the first meeting, he had agreed to engage her. By the end of the first review, he was communicating with her with something approaching ease. By April, he was corresponding regularly between visits with questions about specific account items, questions that showed a mind beginning to attend to its own affairs with new seriousness. She found this gratifying. Not because it meant she was no longer needed, quite the opposite. The more her clients engaged with their own accounts, the more useful her work became, because the questions they asked directed her attention to things they had noticed but not yet understood, and these were often exactly the things that rewarded looking at most carefully. She had, by April, 3 formal engagements. She had, by April, a solicitor who had begun to understand what she was doing and to handle her professional letters with appropriate competence. She had, by April, a separate bank account that contained more money than she had ever had access to in her life. Not a vast amount, by the standards of the estates she was working with, but an amount that was hers, that she had earned, that she had control over, and that meant that if she chose to do something specific with it, she could, without asking permission from anyone. This was not a thing she spent time celebrating. She was not a person who celebrated things that she had simply done correctly. She acknowledged them, filed them, and moved forward. But she was aware of it, the weight of this account balance, in the same way she was aware of all important facts, carefully and completely. The Easter visit at Ashford Hall that year was the first family gathering she had attended since the November confrontation with Graves, and it was different from every previous family gathering she could remember. Not dramatically different. The chandelier was still dull, though she had noticed in March that it had been cleaned, for the first time in years, and the crystals had recovered something of what they must have been when her grandfather brought them from Edinburgh. The table was still the long table. Her father was still at the head of it. Oliver was still beside him. But the people around the table had shifted in relation to one another, the way furniture shifts in a room when something large has been moved, not drastically, not catastrophically, but enough that the space between things has changed, and the room feels different, even though everything is technically still there. Her father asked her, at Easter dinner, about the Farrow engagement. He asked specifically about the dispute resolution process and whether the account analysis had contributed to the legal outcome. He asked the way a man asks about something he has genuine interest in and some understanding of, which was a different quality of question from any she had previously received from him at this table. She answered him directly. She described what she had found and how it had been applied. She described the structure of the report she had submitted and the specific categories of evidence that had been most useful. He listened. Oliver listened. Frederick ate his lamb and paid only moderate attention, but this was Frederick's relationship with most things, and she had long ago decided it was not personal. Her mother, across the table, watched the conversation between Alara and her father with the careful, composed expression she always wore. But behind it, very slightly, there was something else. Something that Alara recognized because she had been watching her mother's face very carefully for 22 years. It was the particular look her mother wore when something in the world was fitting together in a way she had hoped it might, but had not allowed herself to count on. She looked like someone who had waited for something and was watching it arrive. After dinner, Oliver found Alara in the library, which she had gone to on habit, the way she always went there after family meals when she needed a few minutes of quiet to settle herself. He stood in the doorway with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was the expression of a man who has something to say and is not certain how to say it without compromising a version of himself he has been maintaining for a long time. He said, "I have been wondering if you might look at the tenant farm accounts." She said, "Which one?" He said, "The North Farm, the one I told Father about last autumn, the equipment investment. I have been working on the plan, and I think the numbers are right, but I want someone to check them before I present it to Father formally." She looked at her brother. She said, "All right, send me the figures." He said, "I know you think the plan is not good." She said, "I do not think the plan is bad. I think some of the figures need checking. Send them to me and I will look." He said, "And you will tell me honestly." She said, "I will tell you honestly." He nodded. He was about to leave, and then he said, without turning back, "I should have listened to you more. All those years. About everything." She said, "You did not know I had anything worth listening to." He said, "That is not entirely an excuse." She said, "No, but it is part of the explanation. Send me the figures, Oliver." He left. She sat in the library for a few minutes. She thought about Oliver, who had spent 26 years believing he was the one in the family who understood things, and who was in the process of revising this belief in a way that was uncomfortable and necessary, and who had just asked for her help with his numbers, which was an act of revision that cost him something, and which she chose to receive generously, because she understood the cost. She thought about her father, asking her questions at the dinner table with genuine interest. She thought about her mother's careful, composed face. She thought about the chandelier, cleaned for the first time in years. Small things. All of them small things. But the accumulation of small things was how large things changed. She had always believed this, the same way she believed that careful small entries in a ledger, consistently made, over time, built a picture of something real. She went back to the dining room. She had another cup of tea with her mother. They sat together in the quieting down of the Easter evening, and her mother talked about the garden plans for the spring, and Alara listened and made suggestions, and at one point her mother laughed at something she said, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and the sound of it in the room was like the sound of a window being opened. When Alara left to go to her room, her mother held her arm again, the same way she had at the garden door in November, the same brief touch, but this time she also said, "I am proud of you. I should have said it before. I am very proud of you." Alara stood at the bottom of the stairs. She said, "Thank you, Mother." She went upstairs. She stood in her room for a moment. She opened the wardrobe. She moved the 2 dresses. The notebook was there, the plain cloth-covered book. She took it out and held it, not opening it, just holding it, feeling the weight of 6 years of evenings in her hands. She put it back. She put the dresses back. She closed the wardrobe. She sat at her desk and looked at the window, where the April night was not the heavy November dark, but something thinner and more silvery, with the first real warmth of spring sitting somewhere underneath the cool, the way warmth returns in the north, quietly and without announcement, until suddenly, one morning you step outside, and it is there. She thought about the months ahead, the work, the 3 engagements, the schedule, the reports she would write, and the accounts she would read, and the patterns she would find, and the things she would fix, that nobody else in the rooms where they happened would know to fix, until they found that they were already fixed. She thought about what it felt like to be on the way to somewhere, rather than at the end of a table. She had never thought she would need to describe this feeling, because she had assumed, for a long time, that the feeling was simply the way most people lived, and that the absence of it in her particular life was a condition specific to her particular circumstances. She was beginning to understand that this was not entirely true, that many people sat at the end of their own tables in various ways, invisible, capable, patient, holding notebooks under metaphorical dresses, waiting for the right moment, and that what had made her situation specific was not the sitting at the end, but the not giving up on what she knew she was building. She thought, I should write this down. Not for any purpose, not for anyone, just to have it written, in the same way she had written everything important for 6 years, because writing things down was how she confirmed them, how she gave them the solidity of ink on paper that made them real, in a way that thoughts alone were not. She took a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "What I know now, that I did not know when I began." She wrote for a long time. When she had finished, she read it back. Then she folded the paper and placed it inside the plain notebook, under the dresses, where the 6 years of numbers were. She blew out the candle. She lay in the dark. She was not afraid of anything in particular. She was simply in the middle of her life, which was exactly where she had always intended to be. She closed her eyes. Outside, the spring night held the estate in its new, barely warmer air, and somewhere across the fields the Voss land began, and beyond that the Hartley land, and beyond that the Farrow land, and the county lay in its dark, and its order, and its complicated human arrangements, and somewhere in all of it, 3 sets of account books were resting, properly maintained, carefully watched, by someone who had spent 6 years learning how to watch. She slept. She had an early train to catch in the morning. She was going to Aldenmere. There were numbers that needed her attention. She was very glad that they did. The train from the county station took 40 minutes to the junction, and from the junction, a carriage met her, because she had written ahead, and the Aldenmere household had begun, without being asked, to arrange this for her monthly visits. She sat in the carriage with her notebooks on her knee, and watched the county go by, the limestone ridge, and the lower hills and the wide fields that were just beginning, in this second week of April, to show the first thin green of the new growing season. She thought about Oliver's tenant farm figures, which he had sent her 2 days after Easter, in a letter that was surprisingly thorough, and showed considerably more careful thinking than she had expected. The plan was not bad. The equipment investment was sound in principle. The figures he had produced for the projected return were slightly optimistic, in her view, but correctable. She had written back a detailed response, 3 pages, identifying the specific assumptions she questioned, and suggesting the adjustments that would make the projection more reliable. He had replied overnight, which was fast for Oliver, and had said, "I see what you mean about the yield assumption. I will rework the numbers. Can I send them back to you next week?" She had said yes. This small back and forth, taking place over letters between siblings who had spent 22 years in the same house, without exchanging anything of genuine substance, was one of the things she had placed in the category she thought of as changes worth noting. Not dramatic, not something she needed to spend energy on, just something worth noting, which was what she did with all things of significance. She noted them, filed them, and moved on with the work. She arrived at Aldenmere at 11. Mrs. Carver met her at the door, which was now a familiar routine. A brief, efficient exchange about the room, the schedule, whether she needed anything before she started work. The study had been prepared, the relevant ledgers on the desk in the order she had established, the accounts notebook from the previous month alongside them for reference, a cup of tea arriving 5 minutes after she sat down, without being asked. She began. The April review had one specific focus she had flagged from the previous month's session, which was the household supply pattern she had identified and agreed to investigate against regional market pricing. She had done this preliminary investigation during March, had compiled the relevant comparison data, and was now in a position to set it against the actual purchase records. The answer was not fraud. The answer was more mundane and in some ways more fixable than fraud. The household supply purchasing had been running on a contract with a single supplier that had been negotiated 3 years ago, and in the intervening 3 years, Market prices for several of the items in the contract had shifted significantly, in one case by almost 20%, and the contract price had not been renegotiated. Nobody had noticed because nobody had checked the contract against current rates. She wrote this up. She identified the specific items and the specific discrepancy, and she calculated what renegotiating the contract at current rates would save annually. The number was not enormous, but it was not nothing either. She wrote, "Recommend immediate contact with supplier regarding contract review. Set 3-year renegotiation cycle going forward. Suggest competitive quotes be obtained for each renewal cycle." She noted that this was not a matter of dishonesty, but of administrative inertia, and that the solution was systemic rather than punitive. She also noted, because she always noted things that had not happened but could have, that the open door of a non-reviewed contract was a vulnerability, and that a supplier who was less honest than this one could have been doing considerably more damage with the same opportunity, and had not been, which was something worth acknowledging. She finished the review. She wrote the report. She presented it at supper. The Duke read it with the usual attention. He said about the supply contract, "I had no idea it had not been reviewed. That is exactly the kind of thing that was happening without my knowledge," she said. "It is precisely the kind of thing that consistent oversight is meant to catch." He said, "Yes," she said. "Shall I write to the supplier directly, or would you prefer to do it?" He said, "You write to them. You have the figures. You are in the best position to negotiate." She said, "All right." It was, in the context of a professional relationship, a very natural exchange, the sort of thing that would be unremarkable in any working arrangement. She registered it as natural and unremarkable, which was itself notable, because natural and unremarkable were not words that had applied to her professional life 3 months ago, because she had not had a professional life 3 months ago. She ate her food. After supper, in the drawing room, she said, "I have been thinking about the structure of the ongoing arrangement." He looked up from his book. She said, "As the work across 3 estates has developed a rhythm, I have been thinking about what form the arrangement should take going forward. The current structure, monthly visits, formal reports, is working, but I would like to propose a small change." He said, "What change?" She said, "At present, I write separate reports for each estate, with no cross-reference. I believe there is additional value in occasionally writing a combined analysis, not of specific account items, but of patterns across estates. Patterns in how suppliers are managed, how staff turnover affects account continuity, how regional market movements hit different estate categories at different times. A view across multiple estates produces insights that no single estate review can." He said, "You are proposing a broader analytical function." She said, "I am proposing that what I am building here is more than account oversight. It is a body of knowledge about how estates of this size manage their finances, and that knowledge has value not only to the individual estate, but to the broader understanding of how these things work and what the risks are." He sat back. He said, "You are thinking about writing this up." She said, "I am thinking that in 2 or 3 years, when I have sufficient data across enough estates, I might have something worth writing. A practical guide, not academic, specific, actionable, the kind of thing that would have helped my father if anyone had written it before now." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That would be an extraordinary thing to produce." She said, "It would be a useful thing to produce. Whether it is extraordinary depends on how well it is executed." He said, "Have you told Sir Henry about this thinking?" She said, "Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because Aldenmere is where the work began, and because you were the first person to take it seriously. I owe you the first conversation." He looked at her across the lamplit drawing room. He said, "I am glad you told me." She said, "So am I." They sat. The fire was lower than usual. She had not noticed how late it had become. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 9:10, which was later than she usually stayed in the drawing room. She had been, she realized, enjoying the conversation in a way that had caused her to lose track of time, which was not something that happened to her often, because she was generally extremely attentive to time and where it was going. She said, "I should go up." He said, "Yes." She stood. She picked up her notebook. At the door, she paused, as she had done before. and this time he was watching when she paused, and she said, Aldrich. She had not used his name before. The arrangement had always been Miss Ashford and Duke Voss, formal, professional, appropriate. She had not consciously decided to use his name now. It had arrived in her mouth without a preceding decision, which was unusual for her, and she noted this with the same quality of attention she gave to all unusual occurrences, calmly, without alarm. He was very still. She said, Thank you, for the letter of introduction, for the arrangement, for asking the question in the library about what I wanted. I have not said it properly before. He said, You do not need to thank me. You would have found your way here regardless. She said, Perhaps, but it would have taken longer. He said, That is probably true. She said, Good night. He said, Good night, Alara. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in her room at Aldenmere for a moment, in the dark, not lighting the lamp. She thought, That is the first time either of us has used the other's given name. She thought, I used it first. She thought, This is information. She filed it, quietly, in the part of her mind where she kept things that were important, and which she did not yet know what to do with. Not because she was uncertain of their value, but because the right time to act on them had not yet arrived. She lit the lamp. She changed. She slept. In the morning, she woke before the house, which she always did, and she sat at the small desk in the Aldenmere East Wing room with her notebook and planned her day. And outside the window the April morning was coming up over the limestone ridge, the first light turning the long grass of the home field, the color of something warm. And she thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Not at the end of anything. At the middle. Working forward. She opened her notebook. She began to write. 2 years after the November supper, when she had told the Duke that the accounts were not in excellent order, she sat in a room in the county town with a young woman she had never met before, who had been sent to her by Sir Henry, who had described the situation in a brief letter as a capable girl in an impossible house, the kind you understand better than I can explain. The young woman's name was Harriet Doyle. She was 19. She had come into the county town alone, on the morning coach, without telling anyone she was coming, and she had knocked on the door of the small office that Alara had been renting since February, the first professional space she had occupied that was entirely her own, 3 rooms above a stationer's shop, with a view of the market square and a coat rack by the door that she had bought herself. Harriet Doyle sat across from her and said, very quietly, without any preamble, Sir Henry said you would understand. I hope he is right. I have been managing my uncle's accounts for 3 years without his knowledge, and I have found something, and I do not know what to do with it. Alara looked at her. She looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Tell me everything. It took 45 minutes for Harriet to tell her everything, and it took that long not because Harriet was slow or unclear, but because the story was genuinely complex. A family estate with an unusual inheritance arrangement. An uncle who was in declining health and who had handed the practical management of the accounts to his factor some years ago, and who now could not tell, in his declining capacity, whether what he was being told was accurate. And Harriet, who had been helping her uncle with his correspondence for 3 years, had gradually begun to understand the accounts, because her uncle asked her to sit in on the factor's reports, and had gradually noticed, with increasing certainty, that the reports she was hearing did not match the records she was reading. The situation had differences from the Ashford situation. The family dynamics were different. The specific nature of the mismanagement was different. The age of the person who had found it was different. But the shape of it was completely familiar. A person, alone in a room with numbers, seeing what others had not seen, holding the knowledge carefully because they did not yet know who the right person was to give it to. Alara said, when Harriet had finished, What you have found is serious and recoverable. The evidence you have described is usable. The question is who presents it and how, and those are exactly the right questions to be asking. Harriet said, Can you help me? Alara said, Yes, but first I need to ask you something. Harriet waited. She said, What do you want from this? Not for your uncle, not for the estate, for yourself. Harriet looked at her. She had the particular expression of someone who has not expected this question, who has been so focused on the problem in front of her that she has not thought about what she wants on the other side of it. She said, I want to be able to keep doing this. I am good at this work. I know I am good at it. I want to be allowed to be good at it. Alara said, yes, I know. She said it very quietly. She said it in a way that meant, I have sat exactly where you are sitting. I know precisely what this looks like from the inside. She did not elaborate. This was not the moment for her own story. This was the moment for Harriet's. She said, here is what we are going to do. She spent the next 2 hours with Harriet, going through the evidence, helping her organize it in the way that would be most useful for presentation, identifying the specific figures that were most clearly documented, and the specific ones that still needed verification. She asked sharp questions. She pushed on weak points. She made Harriet defend her analysis, not because she doubted it, but because she knew that the first person to challenge it would not be her, and it was better for Harriet to experience that challenge now, in this room, than for the first time in front of the people who needed to be convinced. Harriet was, in fact, very good. Her analysis was not as systematically presented as Alara's had been, not because it was less accurate, but because she had not had 6 years of private practice. She had had 3 years, and no one to teach her. What she had built was genuine and significant. What she needed was the framework around it. Alara gave her the framework. She described, as clearly and specifically as she could, the structure of the presentation, the order of evidence, the way to manage the response from the people in the room, the specific tactic of showing the figures first and allowing the room to sit with them before offering the explanation of what they meant. Harriet wrote everything down. When they had finished, Harriet said, "And you, will you come with me when I present it?" Alara thought about this. She thought about the answer to this question for a moment, not the practical answer, which was straightforward, but the meaning of the answer, in terms of what she was building, and what she believed about how it should be built. She had thought, in the early months, that the right model for what she was doing was essentially solitary. She found the problems. She presented the findings. She managed the aftermath. One person, with a notebook, moving between rooms. But she was beginning to understand something that she had not understood at the beginning, which was that the value of what she did was not only in the finding and the presenting, the value was also in the knowing how, in the ability to teach someone else how to see what she saw, in the possibility of there being more than one person who understood accounts the way she understood them, who sat in quiet rooms in families and houses and estates, watching what others had not seen and building what others had not thought to build. She had been alone in this for a long time. She did not have to be the only one. She said, "Yes, I will come with you, but I will not be the one who speaks. You will be the one who speaks. I will be in the room, so that if there is a challenge that you need support on, you have someone who can confirm your analysis from an independent position. But this is your evidence, and your family, and your moment. Do you understand?" Harriet said, "Yes." She said, "Good." They arranged a date. Harriet went back on the afternoon coach. Alara sat in her office for a while after she had gone, in the quiet of the room, with the market square below the window, and the sound of the town going on in its ordinary way. She thought about a girl of 19 taking the morning coach alone into the county town to knock on a door she had never knocked on before, carrying 3 years of careful work and no certainty that any of it would be received. She thought about the things Sir Henry had said in that letter. A capable girl in an impossible house, the kind you understand better than I can explain. She thought, yes, I understand it precisely. She pulled out a fresh notebook. This was a different notebook from any she had kept before. It was larger, and she had been writing in it since January, and it was the thing she had described to the Duke in the drawing room at Aldenmere, the beginning of the practical guide she intended to write, the account of how estates of this kind managed their finances, and what the risks were, and how those risks could be identified and managed. She had been building it from the material of 2 years of professional work, across 3 estates, with hundreds of pages of specific analysis behind it. It was becoming something real. She could see, now, what it would be when it was finished. She opened it to the next blank page. She wrote, "The role of the second observer." She wrote about what Harriet had done, not by name, but as a case, specific enough to be useful and general enough to be instructive. She wrote about the value of someone in a room who had been watching quietly for long enough to understand the pattern. She wrote about what it required, patience, attention, a willingness to hold information without immediately acting on it, a confidence in your own analysis that was rooted in method rather than in other people's approval. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, she had 6 pages. She closed the notebook. She put on her coat. She went out into the county town market square, which was busy on a Thursday afternoon, full of the ordinary moving life of a town in the north of England in mid-spring. Market stalls and carriages and people with purposes, moving between purposes, and she walked across it without hurrying, and thought about what it meant that she was walking across it as herself, with work that was hers, going somewhere she had chosen to go. She went to the solicitor's office. She met with her own solicitor about a question relating to the Farrow arrangement, and a new inquiry that had arrived that week from a family called Croft, whose estate was 20 miles to the west, and who had been given her name, apparently, by Mr. Farrow himself. The inquiry was the 6th she had received since January. She discussed with the solicitor which engagements to take and which to decline, not because she doubted her own judgment, but because she had found that talking the logic of a decision through with a second mind helped clarify things she might otherwise have assumed rather than examined. This was something else she had learned in 2 years that she had not known at the beginning, that her preference for working alone had been a product of necessity as much as temperament, and that working with people whose judgment she trusted produced better results than working alone, not because they replaced her thinking, but because they extended it. She declined 2 of the 6 enquiries and accepted 1. She told the solicitor she would give him her decision on the remaining 3 by the end of the month. She left the office. She walked back across the market square. The afternoon was warm now, genuinely warm, the way spring finally becomes in the north when it has been building for long enough, and the warmth arrives and stays. She turned her face toward the sun for a moment, standing on the corner of the square, and felt it on her skin. She thought about the Ashford table. She thought about it the way she thought about it now, which was from a distance, with accuracy, and without the weight of sitting inside it. She still went home for family occasions. She still sat with her father in the study when she visited, and talked to him about the accounts, and he listened and asked the better questions he had learned to ask. She still had tea with her mother in the kitchen sometimes, in the early mornings, and they talked about the garden, and occasionally about something more substantial, and once, in March, her mother had asked her what she thought about a decision the estate was facing, and she had given her honest opinion, and her mother had said, "I will mention this to your father." Oliver's tenant farm investment had been approved, with the revised figures, and it was proceeding. Frederick was, as ever, largely unchanged, but had recently begun a correspondence with a land agent in another county that seemed to be developing into something, and he had the look, at Easter, of a person who had found a direction, which Alara thought was the most useful thing that could happen to Frederick at this stage of his life. And the Duke. She thought about the Duke. She thought about him the way she thought about him these days, which was the way she thought about all important things. Carefully, completely, without avoiding what was true. What was true was this: the professional arrangement at Aldenmere was one of the best working relationships she had ever experienced, for reasons that included the quality of his attention, and his directness, and his respect for her work, and his willingness to be told things he had not expected to hear. It was, by itself, worth a great deal. What was also true was that the working relationship was not the only thing that existed between them. She had not spoken about this. He had not spoken about it. They had been, both of them, careful with it, the way careful people are with things that matter, allowing it to exist in the room without forcing it into the open before it was ready. But she was a person who believed in looking at what was actually in front of her, and she was not going to pretend, even internally, that what was in front of her was only professional. She had used his name, in the drawing room, in April, without deciding to. He had used hers immediately after. She had filed this as information. The information had been sitting in its file for 3 weeks. She thought, "I will go to Aldenmere next week, for the May review, and I will not wait for the information to decide for itself what it is. I will look at it directly." She thought, "I am not afraid." She was not afraid of anything in particular. She was in the middle of her life, in the spring sun, in the county town market square, standing outside the solicitor's office where a woman's name was on a professional file for the first time in that firm's 40-year history, and she had work to do, and the work was good, and the world was arranged the way she had spent a long time, quietly and patiently, arranging it to be. She crossed the square. She went back to her office. She hung up her coat. She sat at her desk. She opened the large notebook. She wrote, "What I know now that I did not know when I began." Then she stopped, because she had written that line before, in the smaller notebook, in her room at Ashford Hall in April of the previous year. She had written it, and then folded the page and placed it inside the plain cloth-covered notebook under the dresses, where the 6 years of numbers were. She crossed out the line. She wrote instead, "What comes next?" And she began to write about the practical guide, the chapter about how to read a capital expenditure category against field records, the specific technique of cross-referencing supplier handwriting, the method of comparing purchase prices against regional market rates across time. She wrote in a clear, plain, direct style. She wrote for people who had found themselves alone in quiet rooms, with ledgers they were not supposed to be reading, and knowledge they did not yet know how to use. She wrote for Harriet Doyle. She wrote for herself, the version of herself that had sat at the end of the Ashford table for 6 years, watching everything, saying nothing, building something in the only space available, which was the invisible interior space of a person who had been told she was worthless at every supper, and had quietly, precisely, and without apology, decided not to believe it. She wrote for all of them. She wrote until the light in the office shifted from afternoon to early evening, and the sounds of the market square below changed from the business sounds of a working day to the quieter sounds of a day concluding, and the stationer below closed his shop door, and the street grew still. She set down her pen. She looked at what she had written. It was good. It was very good. She closed the notebook. She stood. She put on her coat. She locked the office. She walked down the stairs and out into the spring evening of the county town, and she turned toward the station, because she was going home tonight, and in the morning she was going to Aldenmere, and there were numbers that needed her attention, and a large notebook that was becoming something significant, and a man who used her name and meant something by it, and a girl named Harriet Doyle who needed to be ready by Thursday, and Oliver's revised farm figures to review, and the Croft estate enquiry to decide on, and a supply contract to renegotiate, and the world was full of things that needed the careful, patient, precise attention of someone who knew what they were looking at and was not afraid of what they would find. She was ready. She had always been ready. She walked to the station. She got on the train. She went home. The train moved north in the long spring evening, through the country she had known all her life, and the light was gold and horizontal across the fields, the particular quality of light that only existed at this time of year, at this time of day, and she sat with her notebook on her knee and did not write in it. She watched the fields go by. She thought about Harriet Doyle, who had come into town alone on the morning coach to knock on a door, and had gone back on the afternoon coach with 6 pages of notes and a date, and something she had probably not had before, which was the certainty that what she knew was worth knowing, and that someone understood why it mattered. She thought about what it would mean to keep doing this, not only the account reviews, which she intended to keep doing, but this other thing, this sitting with a person who was at the beginning of something and helping them understand what they had built and what to do with it. She had not set out to do this. It had happened because Sir Henry had sent Harriet to her, and because she had recognized what Harriet was carrying and had known exactly what it needed. But recognition was a skill, and skills could be applied intentionally. If she chose to make this a part of the work, if she chose to be available to people like Harriet, it would require thought and structure, and probably a different kind of arrangement than the one she currently had. She would think about this. She thought about it now, with the evening fields going past and the notebook on her knee, and by the time the train pulled into the county station, she had the shape of an idea that was not yet fully formed, but which had the feeling of something true. The same feeling she got from a column of figures that was about to resolve into a clear answer. She would let it sit. She was good at letting things sit. The carriage from the station to Ashford Hall was waiting, because she had written ahead, and the journey took 20 minutes, and when she arrived the house was lit with the particular warm light of an evening when someone had expected her and had made the house ready for her return, and she thought, this is also new. This feeling of a house that has been made ready. Her father was in his study when she arrived. He called to her from the open door, and she went in, and he was at his desk with an account book. Her account book. The new one he had started keeping since November with the structure she had recommended. The one that was considerably cleaner and more legible than the old one. He said, the March quarter figures. I have been looking at the Northfield income, and I think I have made an error in the categorization. Can you look at it before supper? She sat down. She looked. He had not made an error. He had made a distinction she had not taught him yet, between a capital item and a revenue item, and the two categories had overlapped in a way that was genuinely ambiguous in the specific situation. She explained the distinction. He understood it quickly. He re-entered the figure in the correct category. He said, Oliver's farm figures came in under the revised projection this quarter, by the way, favorably. She said, I know. He sent me a note. He said, he is pleased. She said, he should be. The projection was solid. Her father looked at her with the complicated expression she had come to know over the past months, as his version of trying to say something that he did not quite have the words for yet, but which he was working toward. She had learned to let him work toward it without filling in the silence. He said, I have been thinking about your grandmother. This was not what she had expected. He said, my mother's mother. You never met her. She died before you were born, but she kept accounts. For my grandfather's estate, in the generation before ours. Did this for 30 years. He relied on her completely. He paused. I had forgotten this. I was reminded of it last month, when I was going through some of the old papers. There was a letter to her from my grandfather, describing the estate accounts, and asking her to check something in the quarterly figures. He stopped. I should have remembered this much earlier. Elara looked at her father. She said, what was her name? He said, Eleanor. We called her Nell, though her full name was Eleanor. She thought about a woman named Eleanor, in a different room, in a different generation, keeping accounts that her husband relied on, and whether Eleanor had ever sat at the end of a table and been told she was worthless, and whether Eleanor had kept a second book. She thought, I hope she had someone who asked to see it. She said, tell me more about her sometime. He said, I will. She stayed in the study for another 10 minutes, and then went upstairs to change for supper, and at the supper table her mother had arranged flowers from the early garden, the first yellow flowers of the spring, in the low bowl that had sat in the middle of the table since before Elara was born, and the light from the chandelier, cleaned now, came through the crystals and made small bright spots on the table around the bowl. She sat down. Not at the end. Her mother had quietly, and without announcement, rearranged the table over the past months, moving the settings so that the family sat closer together, not in a way that required any acknowledgement, simply as a gradual change in where the plates were placed each evening. She had not said anything about it. It had simply happened. Elara was now 4 places from the head of the table. She did not know when this had become the arrangement. She did not ask. She ate her supper. After supper she sat with her mother for half an hour, and then went upstairs and sat at her desk and thought about the week ahead. Aldenmere, Monday and Tuesday. Harriet's presentation on Thursday. The Croft enquiry to respond to. The large notebook. The chapter about capital expenditure. She thought about what she had written at the end of Part 1 of the guide, which she had titled, not Part 1, but simply, The Beginning. She had written, the most important quality is not brilliance. It is not formal education. It is not the courage to confront. It is the willingness to look at what is actually in front of you, and to write down what you see, precisely and without softening, and to trust that precision has value, even when nobody around you is asking for it. Keep a second book, not because you expect anyone to ask for it, because it is true. And the truth, if it is written clearly enough and long enough, eventually finds the person who needs to see it. She reread this. She did not change a word. She closed the notebook. She lay down. She thought about Eleanor, who had kept accounts for 30 years, and about Harriet Doyle on the morning coach, and about her father at his desk with the corrected quarterly figures, and about her mother's hand on her arm at the garden door, and about the first light on the limestone ridge from the east window of the Aldenmere guest room, and about the word exceptional, spoken in a small library in November, which had been the first word of its kind anyone had ever directed at her in her own home. She thought about a duke who had come to buy a field and had stayed for the numbers. She thought about what came next. What came next was morning. What came after morning was Monday. What came after Monday was the rest of it. She was not afraid. She closed her eyes. She slept. And the house was quiet around her, and the county was quiet beyond the house, and somewhere in the particular darkness of a spring night in the north of England, a plain cloth-covered notebook sat under 2 dresses in a wardrobe, holding 6 years of numbers that had started everything, and it would stay there for a very long time, and she intended never to throw it away, because the place where something begins matters, and she had not forgotten where she began. She had only moved past it. Forward. Into the work that was hers. Into the life she had been, patiently, and precisely, and without anyone's permission, building all along.